It begins in the still hush of Kensington Palace morning light, sliding across gilt frames and brocade curtains, the muted hum of London awakening beyond its walls. A baby's cry echoed once, through those chambers on the 24th of May, 1819, the same city that centuries earlier had watched kings and queens rise and fall in the flicker of candles and the smoke of wars. She would be named Alexandrina Victoria, an unlikely heir, a small figure in lace and linen, whose birth seemed to matter little to the grand geometry of empire. Yet fate had quietly moved its pieces, and the world was about to enter an age that would carry her name forever. This is the story of Queen Victoria, the girl who grew beneath shadowed ceilings, the woman who would reign over a world transformed by steam, steel, and sorrow. At first, no one imagined she would be queen. She was born fifth in line to the throne, the daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George III, and of a widowed German princess, Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. The royal family, sprawling and eccentric, was marked by feuds and fragility. George III, the old king, had slipped into madness, leaving his eldest son to rule as Prince Regent, later George IV, a man more enamoured with art and excess than duty. The line of succession, though crowded, was precarious. None of the king's sons had surviving legitimate heirs. And so, amid the uncertainty, the Duke of Kent, already middle-aged and burdened with debt, married in haste. His purpose was simple: to produce an heir before his brothers could. Victoria's childhood began under the long shadow of this desperation. When she was less than a year old, her father died suddenly of pneumonia, and the infant princess was left fatherless and nearly forgotten by the court. Her mother, Duchess Victoria, a proud and anxious woman, clung fiercely to her child, convinced that her daughter's safety and fortune depended on her vigilance. Together with her ambitious adviser, Sir John Conroy, the Duchess built what would become known as the Kensington system, a rigid, isolating routine designed to keep the young princess obedient and controllable. Life in Kensington Palace was suffocatingly structured. Victoria was not allowed to walk down a staircase without holding someone's hand. She was never left alone, not even to dress or read. Every moment was accounted for. Lessons in languages, music, and decorum. Brief supervised walks in the gardens. Evening prayers whispered in candlelight. The other royal children roamed between palaces and country estates, but Victoria's world ended at the gates of Kensington. She would later describe her childhood as melancholy, remembering the long corridors, the chill of discipline, and the quiet ache of loneliness. Yet, even in confinement, she developed a strong will. Her governess, Baroness Leysen, a stern but affectionate German woman, became her closest companion and protector against her mother's controlling circle. It was Leysen who encouraged Victoria's independence of thought, who slipped stories of queens and heroines into her lessons, who praised her courage, and who taught her to sign her name not as a timid girl but as one conscious of destiny. The small girl's eyes, bright blue and alert, would study the portraits lining the palace walls. Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and other Tudor ancestors seemed to gaze back at her, silent reminders of what monarchy demanded: strength, solitude, and survival. The young princess began to feel that she was, somehow, apart, that a weight unseen hovered near her life. Her diary, which she began at 13, reveals both the sweetness and sharpness of her mind. "I am very happy today," she once wrote, "because I saw my dear Uncle Leopold." Leopold, her mother's brother, had become King of the Belgians and was her most trusted guide. He treated her not as a child, but as a future sovereign. He spoke to her about responsibility, about duty, about what it meant to be beloved by one's people. He saw in her something that others dismissed, a seriousness that lay beneath her girlish laughter. The royal court, meanwhile, watched her grow with cautious curiosity. George IV, vain and aging, kept his distance. His successor, his brother William IV, known as the Sailor King, ruled with good nature but little tact. He had no surviving legitimate children, and so the line of succession again pointed to the small girl in Kensington. The court gossiped about her every lesson, every illness, every hint of character. Would she be pliant, like her mother wished, or stubbornly independent, like her Hanoverian blood suggested? By her early teens, Victoria sensed that the walls around her were both prison and protection. The Duchess and Sir John Conroy sought to tighten their influence, grooming her to accept Conroy as her private secretary once she became queen. He flattered and manipulated, demanding obedience, but Victoria's patience thinned. When Conroy attempted to coerce her into signing documents naming him her official advisor, she refused, even through tears and illness. "I shall never forget," she wrote, "how my mother and Sir John tried to frighten me, but I was determined." That quiet defiance was the first glimmer of the steel that would later define her reign. The years passed, and London itself changed. Outside the palace gates, steam engines chugged across iron rails, factories spread along the Thames, and soot mingled with fog. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping Britain into the workshop of the world, drawing thousands into crowded cities. The world Victoria would one day inherit was no longer a land of rural tradition, but a vast, restless engine of modernity. In 1836, at the age of 17, the princess was introduced to her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a reserved young man with soulful eyes and a passion for art and reform. Their meeting, arranged by Uncle Leopold, left a quiet impression. Victoria found him extremely handsome, yet politics and family ambition kept romance at bay. It was too soon, and the throne was still not hers. The following year, the old King William IV fell ill. Tension gripped the palace. The Duchess, eager for power, prepared for the day her daughter would ascend, but the court distrusted her, whispering that Conroy would attempt to rule through Victoria. The king himself detested the Duchess's scheming, famously declaring that he hoped to live until the girl was of age to prevent that woman from becoming regent. On the morning of the 20th of June, 1837, just after dawn, a carriage rattled through the quiet London streets. Inside were messengers from Windsor Castle, carrying solemn news. The king was dead. The 18-year-old princess, still in her nightgown, was awakened by her mother's trembling voice. "My child," she whispered, "the Archbishop and the Lord Chamberlain are here." Victoria rose from her bed, her hair uncombed, her heart thudding. She stepped into the small drawing-room, where the officials bowed low before her. "Your Majesty," said the Archbishop, and with that address, childhood ended. The world seemed to tilt in that instant. The pale morning light caught the edge of the furniture. The ticking of a clock filled the silence, and the young queen felt the weight of history descend upon her like a cloak of stone. "I was calm," she later wrote. "I felt that it was a solemn moment, and I prayed to God to help and guide me." Outside, bells tolled through the fog. Londoners stopped in the streets, reading the handbills that announced the new reign. Some were sceptical, a girl, barely grown, alone in a palace surrounded by ambitious courtiers. Others felt an unexpected stirring of hope. After decades of corrupt, aging monarchs, the new queen's youth seemed a promise of renewal. Her first act was small yet symbolic. She requested to see her ministers alone. The Duchess and Conroy, who had long shadowed her every movement, were excluded. In that gesture, Victoria declared her independence, not only from her mother's influence, but from the claustrophobic childhood that had sought to shape her will. She would be her own ruler. The nation's gaze turned toward her. Newspapers described her as modest, unaffected, and intelligent. Painters captured her delicate features and upright posture. She became a figure of fascination, half child, half sovereign. The people were charmed by her sincerity, her evident sense of duty. Yet behind her composure lingered fear. The crown glittered, but its edges were sharp. Her coronation, held at Westminster Abbey in June 1838, was both magnificent and chaotic. The ceremony, meant to symbolize divine order, unfolded with near-comic disorder, mishandled rituals, lost crowns, stumbling bishops. Still, as the organ thundered and the archbishop anointed her forehead, Victoria felt an electric certainty. This was her calling. "I shall be good," she wrote that night. "I wish to do my duty." London erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the streets, fireworks flared above the Thames, and for the first time in generations, the monarchy seemed beloved again. Yet beneath the jubilation stirred the deeper currents of the age, the hunger of the poor, the unrest of workers, the ambitions of empire. All would soon test the resolve of this young queen. In those early months, she rose before dawn, her small frame wrapped in shawls against the chill, and sat at her desk surrounded by piles of correspondence. She wrote in a neat, slanted hand dispatches to ministers, notes to family, entries in her diary. Her pen moved swiftly, her mind sharper than her critics imagined, but every signature carried weight, each decision a lesson in power. She trusted her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, a charming and worldly statesman who became her mentor and, in some ways, her surrogate father. He guided her through constitutional nuance and political theatre, teaching her how to balance affection with authority. She adored him, calling him Lord M in her journals, and their friendship shaped her first years of reign. Yet this closeness also drew scandal. The court whispered of impropriety. The public wondered if the young queen was being manipulated. Still, she learned, each council meeting, each audience with parliamentarians, was a step toward mastery. She absorbed the rhythms of governance, the intricacies of policy, and the delicate dance between monarchy and democracy. Britain, after all, was no longer an absolute kingdom. The Queen ruled through persuasion, not command. Her strength lay not in decrees but in influence, the ability to embody national unity while the machinery of government turned behind her. But isolation lingered like an echo. In the vast halls of Buckingham Palace, her new home Victoria often felt the chill of solitude. The grandeur that surrounded her could not disguise the ache of distance from ordinary life. Even her meals were spectacles, her walks observed, her letters scrutinized. To reign was to live forever in public view, and she felt both exhilaration and exhaustion from the constant gaze. Her diary from this period flickers between determination and longing. "I am resolved to be good," she wrote, "but oh, how heavy is the crown when one's heart is still young." The empire watched this transformation, from a shy princess to a monarch of resolve. She was learning to harness not only her authority but her image. Her portrait appeared on coins, her name in newspapers, her demeanour discussed in every parlour. In an age when the world was shifting under the weight of progress, she became a fixed point of fascination. The young queen's reign had begun in innocence, but soon the tempests of politics and emotion would test her mettle. Yet for now, in the early glow of coronation, London seemed bathed in a rare optimism. Horse-drawn carriages rattled through the streets beneath bunting and gaslight, and from the palace balcony, Victoria looked out upon her city, the city that would grow with her, that would age with her, that would one day remember her as more than a ruler. She was not yet 20. The engines of empire roared beyond her windows, and the world held its breath for the reign that was just beginning. The unexpected throne. The morning she awoke, as queen had already begun to fade from memory when she first took her seat at the head of government. The air of London was damp, the smell of horse sweat and coal drifting through the open windows of Buckingham Palace, and the distant tolling of bells still echoed in her chest. The nation had changed her name overnight, no longer the Princess, but Her Majesty Queen Victoria. She was barely 18, small of stature, her voice gentle and high, but within her heart was a growing iron will. The ministers expected a puppet, the public expected a child, and the courtiers expected to rule her as they pleased. Yet, behind the modesty of her manner, she already understood that the first moments of a reign could define everything that followed. The young queen's first council took place that same morning. Arrayed before her were the highest men in the land, lords, generals, bishops, men with white hair and the stiffness of command. They bowed deeply as she entered, and one by one they raised their heads to find her gaze steady upon them. Her words were few, but her tone betrayed no fear. She thanked them for their service, assured them of her trust, and promised to govern according to the laws and customs of the kingdom. That single meeting, modest and brief, set the tone of a reign that would span more than 6 decades. The public saw her coronation the following year as the dawning of renewal. The last years of William IV had been uneasy, and the memories of George IV's excesses still lingered like perfume and decay in the air. Britain hungered for purity, for purpose, for a monarch who might embody restraint and virtue. Newspapers carried sketches of the new queen smiling beneath the crown, and poems were written to her youth and innocence. She became, for a moment, the nation's mirror, its hopes projected upon her like light on glass. In the quiet of her chambers, however, she battled fatigue, the crushing tide of correspondence, and the loneliness of power. She rose early, wrote letters to her uncles in Europe, and reviewed dispatches while sipping tea alone. The day stretched through endless meetings, with secretaries, ministers, ambassadors. Her evenings were consumed by ceremony balls, audiences, banquets, yet every hour reminded her that she was an untested figure in a world built by men. It was Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, who became her steady compass. His demeanour was urbane, his conversation gentle, his knowledge of politics encyclopedic. He treated her not as a sovereign to be flattered, but as a pupil to be guided. Through him, she learned the delicate art of constitutional monarchy. The sovereign reigns, but does not rule. It was a paradox that would define her life. Her influence would be measured not by decree, but by persuasion, by the subtle weight of her opinion whispered into the right ear at the right time. Melbourne's counsel soothed her nerves, and his presence filled the void left by the father she had never known. They spent long hours in conversation about the business of state, the moral duties of monarchy, and the poetry of politics. The press soon romanticized this bond, seeing in it a sentimental story of the old guiding the young. What they could not see was the sincerity with which Victoria clung to him as her first anchor in a turbulent sea. Her affection for Melbourne grew almost filial, and his absence brought her visible sorrow. When Parliament criticised his administration, she took it as a personal wound. The political world around her was sharpening, reforming, and already she found herself entangled in the quarrels of parties and the jealousies of statesmen. The Whigs, Melbourne's party, relied on her favour. The Tories distrusted her youth and independence. The bedchamber crisis of 1839 tested her grasp of power when the Tory leader, Sir Robert Peel, refused to form a government unless she dismissed her ladies of the bedchamber, most of whom were wives and daughters of Whig politicians. Victoria, indignant, refused. She saw the demand as an intrusion into her private life. The standoff collapsed, the negotiations, and Melbourne returned to power. The public adored her defiance, but behind the applause murmured a dangerous truth. The Queen's first political decision had been guided by sentiment, not prudence. Time would temper her impulsiveness, but it would not break her will. Each mistake deepened her understanding of balance, the line between affection and duty, between personal loyalty and national responsibility. In the quiet of her diary, she confessed the fatigue of growing into her crown. "I feel," she wrote, "that I am still learning to be what they call a sovereign." Yet the learning never ended. As months turned into years, her confidence sharpened. She presided at council meetings with increasing authority, memorizing the intricate genealogies of Europe's royal houses, the shifting alliances of cabinets, the subtle hierarchies of etiquette. At dinners, she learned to steer conversation towards subjects that revealed the temper of her guests. Naval officers on the state of the fleet, industrialists on the price of coal, ministers on colonial reforms. Every detail was noted, weighed, and stored within her memory. She was forming her style of monarchy, not flamboyant like her predecessors, but methodical, attentive, and deeply personal. The palace itself was changing around her. When she first entered Buckingham Palace, it was little more than a draughty shell. The walls sweated with damp, the chimneys smoked, and the corridors smelled faintly of gas and tallow. Yet within a few years it began to reflect her taste. Floral chintz, soft carpets, portraits of family, the scent of lilac and wax polish. The grandeur softened into domesticity, the royal household into a home. That domestic image, the earnest, disciplined young woman who worked hard and lived modestly, became her greatest weapon. It separated her from the image of the frivolous, scandal-laden monarchs who had preceded her. But the world beyond those walls demanded attention. Britain was the crucible of the Industrial Revolution. Steam power, once a novelty, now roared through the nation's veins. Railways crisscrossed the countryside, black smoke rising from new towns, carrying goods and workers faster than any monarch's decree could travel. The empire's heartbeat quickened. India, Canada, the Caribbean, and Australia pulsed with trade and ambition. Inventions multiplied. Photography captured light on metal plates, telegraphs sent messages through copper veins, and factories poured out goods that reached every corner of the earth. The young queen watched all this from her study window, marvelling and fearing in equal measure the unstoppable advance of progress. Her ministers debated laws of reform, the rights of labourers, the conditions of the poor. In smoky committee rooms, arguments about child labour, sanitation, and suffrage filled the air. The monarchy, though still draped in splendour, was increasingly symbolic, a figurehead above the machinery of a rapidly modernising state. Victoria's instinct told her that survival depended on adaptation. To remain beloved, the crown must appear moral, industrious, and sincere. She could not command factories to close or railways to stop, but she could embody the virtues the new middle class prized: respectability, family, and faith. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Europe was restless. Monarchies trembled beneath the pressure of revolutions, nationalism, and reform. The young queen observed these storms from her island throne, watching kings fall and republics rise, and felt both sympathy and caution. She understood that her own stability rested not upon divine right alone, but upon the consent of her people. It was a lesson she would never forget. In the midst of all this, her personal life stirred with the first signs of affection that would soon alter everything. Letters from her cousin Prince Albert arrived occasionally from Germany, polite, restrained, filled with updates on family and music. He was her mother's nephew, the son of the Duchess's brother, and though their first meeting years earlier had been brief, it lingered in her mind. Uncle Leopold, ever the strategist, continued to hint that a union between them would strengthen dynastic ties. She resisted at first, reluctant to lose her freedom just as she had begun to taste it. But time, and Albert's quiet gravity, worked their influence upon her heart. In the spring of 1839, he visited England again. He was 20, serious, with dark eyes that seemed to see directly into the soul. She, now queen in her own right, found herself uncharacteristically nervous. When he entered the room, dressed in military uniform, she later wrote that she thought him beautiful. That same evening, she could not sleep. She paced her chambers, the memory of his presence filling her mind like a song she could not silence. Within days, she resolved that she would marry him and, as protocol dictated, she proposed to him herself. The announcement of their engagement stunned the public. Some doubted the wisdom of bringing a foreign prince into Britain's highest seat. Others saw in it the continuation of Europe's tangled dynastic web. Yet the sincerity of their affection won hearts. The wedding, held on a grey February morning in 1840 at the Chapel Royal of St James's Palace, was both solemn and radiant. Victoria wore a gown of white satin trimmed with orange blossoms, her veil held by a wreath of myrtle. The choice of white, unusual at the time, would set a fashion that echoed through centuries of bridal tradition. As the organ thundered and the vows were spoken, London streets filled with cheering crowds. Carriages lined the mall, church bells rang, and gun salutes shook the air. The young Queen, who had once walked the corridors of Kensington alone, now stepped into a new chapter not only as a sovereign but as a wife. She wrote that evening, "I never spent such an evening. My dearest, dear Albert sat on a footstool by my side, and his excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before." Yet even amid the bliss of marriage, the responsibilities of the throne remained. She continued to meet with her ministers daily, to read dispatches, to sign acts of parliament. Albert quickly proved himself not a mere consort but an intellectual equal. He shared her passion for order, reform, and progress. Together they would soon forge a partnership that would shape not only their own lives but the character of the entire age. For now, though, the new queen stood upon the threshold of transformation. She had navigated her first years of power, outlived her mentor's doubts, and tasted the strange mixture of loneliness and authority that came with rule. Her reign was no longer a fragile experiment. It had become a living thing, a rhythm that pulsed through the heart of the empire. The world beyond London's fog was changing faster than any monarch could measure, but she had begun to grasp the truth that would define her life, that monarchy, to endure, must learn to mirror its people's dreams while remaining steady in its purpose. As the lamps burned low in Buckingham Palace and the city's murmurs faded into night, Victoria knelt at her bedside, her diary open upon the counterpane. The pen moved with careful precision as she recorded the day's events, the words, half prayer, half testament. "I feel very grateful to heaven for all its mercies, and I hope I shall act with justice and kindness to all." The candlelight trembled across the page. Outside, a train whistle sounded somewhere in the distance, a faint herald of the century she would come to define. The first taste of power. The early years of Victoria's reign were like the slow unfurling of a banner across a restless sky, each gust of political wind revealing another crease in her courage, another test of her resolve. She was no longer the sheltered girl of Kensington, nor the trembling heir at her father's deathbed. The crown now rested firmly on her head, its weight familiar, its meaning deepening each day. Yet, with every morning she sat at her desk beneath the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, she was reminded that being queen meant being watched by the eyes of millions, admired, criticised, and endlessly judged by a world whose expectations never slept. Victoria was learning, at last, what it meant to wield influence. Though her constitutional powers were limited, her presence as monarch gave her voice a sacred gravity. She began to use that voice cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, shaping how her ministers thought, how her people felt, how her empire perceived itself. This new awareness, this first true taste of power, was intoxicating, and at times perilous. Her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840 had brought both partnership and turbulence. Theirs was a union of minds as much as of hearts, both disciplined, orderly, and idealistic. But Albert, raised in the strict traditions of German royalty, struggled to find his place within a monarchy that offered him no formal authority. He was intelligent, methodical, and visionary, yet he was still merely the Queen's husband. Victoria adored him, but she bristled when he attempted to guide her decisions. She had ruled alone. She had fought hard to be taken seriously. Now she had to learn how to share her throne not in title, but in trust. Their disagreements were not the quarrels of indifference, but the friction of equals. Albert, with his reformist mind, often pressed her to think beyond sentiment, to consider the empire as a system to be refined, not merely adored. Victoria, fiercely emotional and loyal, sometimes saw his practicality as coldness, yet in their differences lay their strength. Together they began to build a new model of monarchy, one that was moral, industrious, and deeply rooted in family life. Albert introduced efficiency where ceremony had long suffocated purpose. He reviewed her papers, corrected her correspondence, and organized her daily schedule with military precision. He encouraged her to see politics not as an intrusion upon her emotions, but as a science of human nature. Victoria, in turn, gave warmth to his intellect, teaching him the subtle rhythms of the English people, the poetry of her nation's heart. Their evenings, spent reading aloud or walking the palace gardens, were the quiet counterpoint to the vast noise of empire outside. Beyond those walls, Britain was changing faster than any monarch could measure. The Industrial Revolution thundered onward, iron rails spread like veins across the countryside. The shriek of locomotives echoed through valleys, and factories belched smoke into skies that once knew only the green quiet of fields. The empire's cities swelled with workers. London alone grew to over 2 million souls. Poverty and progress lived side by side, the price of invention paid in soot and hunger. Victoria, though shielded from hardship, felt the tremors of this transformation. Her ministers briefed her on new laws to regulate labour, to end child exploitation in mines and mills, to modernise sanitation. She approved reforms that aligned with her conscience, finding in them a moral purpose that elevated monarchy beyond pageantry. Yet the gap between palace and poverty remained immense. While the royal family's image glowed with virtue and harmony, the alleys of London festered with disease and desperation. The Queen's sympathy was genuine, but her understanding of suffering was still filtered through reports and ceremony. Then came her first real encounter with danger, the attempt on her life. It was June of 1840, only months after her marriage. The young Queen and her husband rode in an open carriage down Constitution Hill when a man stepped forward from the crowd and fired a pistol. The bullet missed. Albert leapt to shield her, and another shot rang out, equally futile. The would-be assassin, Edward Oxford, was quickly seized, and Victoria, astonishingly composed, ordered the carriage to continue as if nothing had happened. That act of courage transformed her image overnight. The public, who had admired her before, now loved her fiercely. The newspapers printed songs and poems in her honour, and crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace cheering her name. The monarchy, once viewed as a fading relic, felt newly alive. The Queen's composure under fire became the symbol of a nation's resilience, but behind the applause, she trembled. In her diary, she wrote of Albert's bravery with gratitude that bordered on devotion. "My dearest Albert was so courageous, so calm. I dare not think what might have happened. The assassination attempt deepened their bond, binding them in the knowledge that their lives were no longer their own." Motherhood soon followed. In November 1840, she gave birth to her first child, Princess Victoria, known affectionately as Vicky. The experience, though joyful, unsettled her. She disliked pregnancy, calling it an occupation of pain and discomfort, and the confinement chafed against her restless need for control. Yet the birth of a healthy heir silenced doubts about the dynasty's future. Within a decade, she would bear 9 children each, a thread in the web of European royalty, each destined to carry her blood into palaces across the continent. As her family grew, so did her awareness of the delicate balance between private joy and public duty. She cherished her domestic life with an almost middle-class devotion, playing with her children, sketching in the nursery, walking with Albert at Osborne House. This image of domestic virtue resonated deeply with her people. In an era that worshipped respectability, the Queen's devotion to home and husband became the moral centre of the empire. She was not merely ruling, she was mothering a nation. Yet the machinery of empire demanded more than affection. The 1,840 brought unrest. The Chartist movement, calling for universal male suffrage, riots over hunger and wages, Irish famine spreading sorrow across the sea. The Queen, though shielded, could not ignore the suffering that rippled through her dominions. When revolutions erupted across Europe in 1848, toppling kings and empires, Britain held its breath. The contagion of rebellion brushed its shores but never broke through. The stability of the crown and the affection of the people for their queen helped preserve order. "Thank God," she wrote, "my people love me." Albert's influence deepened through these trials. He saw the monarchy as a moral institution that must lead by example, not decree. He encouraged scientific patronage, supported education, and took a keen interest in technological progress. The couple's shared fascination with innovation would soon culminate in the grand spectacle of the age, the Great Exhibition of 1851. But before that triumph, their relationship would be tested by politics and grief. Victoria's reliance on her husband sometimes alarmed her ministers. They feared the prince's foreign birth, and his intellectual dominance might shift power behind the throne. Yet she defended him fiercely, asserting his right to advise her. "He is my greatest comfort," she wrote, "my guide in everything." Their partnership, a blend of passion and discipline, became the model of her reign's idealized domestic morality. In the quiet moments of evening, after the lamps were dimmed, Victoria often gazed from the palace balcony over the twinkling city. The gaslights of London shimmered like reflections on water, and the low hum of life reached her ears. She thought of the endless streets beyond the factories, the narrow rooms where families huddled in poverty, and felt both pity and pride. Her reign was transforming Britain into a global workshop, a nation of industry and empire, and she stood at its centre like a figure carved from marble, motionless, observing, enduring. The 1,840 also marked the rise of new social consciousness. Writers like Charles Dickens unveiled the cruelty of industrial life. Reformers demanded justice for the poor. Albert encouraged Victoria to support exhibitions and charitable causes that showcased human progress. Slowly, the crown began to align itself with the moral energies of its age. The monarchy became not only a relic of history, but a living symbol of continuity and conscience. In her journals, Victoria confessed that power no longer frightened her, it fascinated her. She loved the rhythm of governance, the correspondence, the precision of statecraft, but she also understood that every decision carried the potential to divide. The throne was a lonely place, even with Albert beside her. She envied the simplicity of ordinary lives, yet she knew that her purpose lay in sacrifice. "I have the happiness of millions in my hands," she wrote, "and I must not think only of myself." When the Irish potato famine reached its darkest point in the late 1840s, she donated personally to relief efforts, though critics found it meagre compared to the empire's wealth. Still, her gestures mattered symbolically. Her visits to hospitals, her letters to officials, her visible empathy softened the image of monarchy and brought a touch of humanity to the machinery of empire. By the dawn of the 1850s, the young queen who had once doubted her strength had become the moral heartbeat of her nation. The people who once questioned her youth now looked to her as the guardian of their age. She had tasted power, its sweetness and its bitterness, and found in it not arrogance, but duty. The city outside her palace was transforming into the capital of the modern world. Iron bridges spanned the Thames, telegraph wires stitched distance into seconds, and ships bearing the Union Jack carried goods and dreams across oceans. The empire stretched wider than any in history, its reach so vast that a poet might truly say the sun never set upon her dominions. And yet, for all that grandeur, the figure at its centre was still the same small woman with bright eyes and steady voice, the child of Kensington, who had once longed simply to walk downstairs alone. Now she walked across the globe, her name carried in every newspaper, her portrait gazed upon by millions. She had found her footing upon the shifting earth of progress, and though she could not yet see the storms that would one day shake her soul, she stood unshaken. The crown no longer felt heavy. It had become an extension of her being, an emblem of the will she had forged in solitude, a symbol of the bond she had built with her people. For the first time in her life, Queen Victoria knew not only who she was, but what she was meant to be. The Prince from Coburg. The year was 1840, and the heart of the empire trembled not with war, but with wedding bells. A pale London morning broke through the mist, soft as gauze, and the streets filled with the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones, with crowds pressing shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising like steam in the cold. They came to glimpse their young queen, barely 21 years old, and the foreign prince she had chosen to be her husband. The event was not merely a marriage, it was a coronation of the heart, a joining of love and duty that would shape the soul of an entire age. In the dim light of St. James's Palace, Victoria stood robed in white satin, her gown trimmed with lace hand-woven by British artisans, a deliberate gesture of pride in her nation's craft. Around her waist, orange blossoms glowed softly, symbols of innocence and eternal fidelity. On her head, the small wreath of myrtle, green and fragrant, would become a tradition for generations of royal brides. She was nervous, yet radiant, her eyes bright with a mixture of excitement and solemnity. The ceremony began at 1 in the afternoon, the air thick with the scent of wax and flowers, the choir's voices rising to the vaults like prayer. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her cousin from Germany, awaited her at the altar. Tall, broad-shouldered, his expression calm but tender, he wore a uniform of scarlet and gold. He was only 20, but already his presence carried an authority that seemed beyond his years. When their eyes met, something wordless passed between them, a recognition of kinship and destiny. They had met before, when Victoria was 17, and even then she had found him handsome, earnest, and kind. But it was during his second visit in the autumn of 1839 that her feelings deepened into certainty. After only a few days, she could not bear the thought of letting him go. As sovereign, it was she who proposed. "He is so sensible, so kind," she wrote in her diary, "and so good, and so amiable too. He has a most delightful countenance." The marriage was, by the standards of royalty, an act of rare sincerity. Political convenience had little to do with it. Affection was its true foundation. In an age of arranged unions, their love was revolutionary in its tenderness. As the Archbishop's voice echoed through the chapel and the vows were exchanged, the empire witnessed not just the creation of a royal household, but the rebirth of monarchy itself, an institution too often marred by excess, now sanctified by virtue and domestic devotion. Outside, cannon fire rolled across the city, and bells rang from steeples as crowds shouted, "God bless the Queen and her Prince!" The people saw in them a mirror of their own aspirations, a faithful wife, a devoted husband, a family bound by love rather than power. The press, once sceptical of the German prince, began to praise his dignity and intelligence. The monarchy, long seen as a relic, was becoming once again the moral heart of Britain. Yet inside the palace, the path to harmony was not immediate. Victoria, accustomed to independence, bristled at first under Albert's counsel. He was methodical, serious, and possessed a mind honed by discipline. He valued order, duty, and moral reform. She was impulsive, emotional, and fiercely protective of her authority. In private, their tempers clashed. She called him too severe, and he complained that she sometimes acted like a spoiled child. But beneath these quarrels lay a fierce devotion. Both shared an unshakable belief that their union was sacred, and each argument ended in reconciliation that only deepened their affection. The prince's influence on her life soon became profound. He brought to the court a sense of moral gravity and intellectual purpose. Where previous monarchs had filled palaces with gambling, scandal, and extravagance, Albert filled them with music, art, and science. He reorganized the household, improved finances, and insisted on decorum. Servants found him exacting but fair. Ministers discovered a mind of rare acuity. He encouraged the Queen to view governance not as a burden but as a craft to be mastered. "You must not be swayed by feeling," he would tell her. "Think always of what is just, not merely of what is pleasant." His words sometimes stung, but she listened. Together, they became a partnership of balance, his intellect sharpening her instinct, her warmth tempering his austerity. Their shared hours were filled with music, he at the organ or piano, she beside him turning pages, or with long walks through the gardens of Windsor, where they spoke of the future they hoped to build, a Britain not of conquest, but of progress. Albert's arrival also transformed the monarchy's image in the eyes of the public. The sight of the Queen, once solitary, now strolling arm in arm with her husband, and later surrounded by their children, inspired something new, a sentimental connection between crown and people. The Victorians, hungry for stability amid industrial upheaval, found comfort in this image of domestic harmony. Newspapers printed sketches of the royal family at home, by the hearth, surrounded by dogs and laughter. It was monarchy reborn as moral theatre, and the people adored it. But the demands of rule never slept. Only weeks after their wedding, Victoria was struck by the brutal reminder that her crown made her a target. On a spring day in June 1840, as she and Albert rode together through Hyde Park, a young man named Edward Oxford fired 2 pistols at their carriage. The shots missed, and Albert threw himself before her to shield her from harm. The crowd seized the attacker, and though shaken, Victoria ordered the procession to continue. "I am quite unhurt," she insisted, her voice trembling but firm. The incident electrified the nation. The courage of the Queen, her composure under threat, became the talk of Britain. Newspapers lauded her bravery, and the public's affections swelled. Souvenirs were made, songs composed, and for the first time since her coronation, she felt the genuine warmth of national devotion. "My dearest Albert was so brave," she wrote that evening. "The feeling of love and gratitude to God for sparing us both cannot be described." In November of that same year, she gave birth to their first child, the Princess Royal, and the happiness that filled Buckingham Palace was almost luminous. The Queen's health was fragile, the experience harrowing, but when she held her daughter for the first time, she wrote with wonder, "Albert was holding me. It was the happiest day of my life." More children followed in steady rhythm. Albert Edward, later the Prince of Wales, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Each birth carried its own mixture of joy and exhaustion. The nursery became the kingdom's most sacred symbol, a portrait of virtue, discipline, and affection. Yet behind the curtains, Victoria often struggled. She loved her children fiercely, but motherhood brought her little peace. She confessed to feeling trapped by endless confinement and physical weakness. "An ugly baby," she once said bluntly, before guilt softened her tone. She found solace not in maternity but in partnership with her husband. Albert, for his part, embraced fatherhood with tender seriousness. He played with the children, taught them drawing and geography, and took them on excursions to the countryside. His dream was to create a royal family that embodied moral excellence, a dynasty not of indulgence but of service. The discipline he imposed was strict but affectionate. He saw his household as a model for the nation's conscience. Meanwhile, his influence expanded beyond the family. He became the Queen's unofficial private secretary, reviewing her correspondence, advising on foreign affairs, and encouraging reform. His interest in science and engineering led him to champion innovations that would define the century. He envisioned exhibitions to celebrate human ingenuity, schools to elevate education, and architecture that reflected modern progress rather than medieval pomp. Yet, for all his intelligence, the court regarded him with suspicion. As a foreigner and a man of ideas, he was viewed as an intruder in the machinery of British power. Politicians grumbled about his influence, newspapers mocked his seriousness, and whispers circulated that the German prince meddled too much in state affairs. Victoria defended him fiercely. "He is my guide, my support, my all in everything," she declared. Her devotion to him was total, almost spiritual. Together, they weathered the storms of politics and prejudice. Each attack from the press only deepened their solidarity. The 1,840 seconds were years of immense transformation. The railways connecting cities, factories multiplying, the middle class rising, the poor agitating for reform. Amid it all, the Queen and her prince sought to make monarchy not a symbol of excess, but of industrious virtue. Their evenings glowed with the lamplight of study. Their mornings began with letters and reports. To the outside world, they seemed tireless. In truth, their labour was fueled by love for each other and for the empire that had made them its centre. Albert's greatest vision was still to come. In his mind formed the idea of an international exhibition, a gathering of nations to display the triumphs of science, art, and industry. It would be held in London, under a structure of glass and iron that would dazzle the world. Victoria, proud and supportive, embraced his dream. The great exhibition of 1,851 would become their shared masterpiece, a cathedral of progress where invention and beauty would stand side by side. But before that triumph, years of testing awaited them: scandals, sickness, and the shadow of mortality. Yet for now, in the golden dawn of their marriage, they stood united, the young queen and her earnest prince, walking together through the gardens of Windsor, their children's laughter floating through the evening air, the empire stretched around them like a vast, humming instrument, and they, together, were learning how to play its chords. Their love had begun as a spark between cousins from Coburg, but it had become the heart of an age. Theirs was not the loud romance of legend, but the steady flame of partnership, the union of mind and spirit that would define the meaning of Victorian for a century to come. Love and empire. The years that followed the marriage of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert unfolded like a long golden afternoon, an era of expansion, invention, and domestic intimacy woven through with the quiet hum of empire. Their household, though filled with royal protocol, became something new in the history of monarchy, a home of affection, order, and moral gravity. What had begun as the union of a spirited queen and a principled prince grew into a partnership that seemed to radiate outward, touching the very soul of a changing world. Together, they stood at the heart of Britain's transformation, from a traditional kingdom of fields and manor houses into an industrial giant whose engines echoed from Manchester to Bengal. Albert's influence deepened in every corner of the Queen's life. She had once ruled impulsively, guided by emotion and intuition. He brought system, patience, and vision. He was a man of habit, rising early, reading extensively, methodical in thought and movement. Victoria's own rhythms began to align with his. Mornings in Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle often began with the prince reviewing correspondence while the Queen wrote in her diary beside him. Their desks, placed near tall windows overlooking the gardens, bore the marks of constant use: ink stains, blotted pages, piles of government dispatches, invitations, reports, and architectural sketches. Theirs was not the indolent leisure of monarchs past, but the industrious quiet of two people devoted to work. Albert immersed himself in matters of science, urban planning, and education. He corresponded with inventors, read treatises on sanitation reform, and took a keen interest in architecture. He championed the creation of model housing for workers, improved ventilation in schools, and supported the arts as instruments of public moral education. Victoria, always quick to feel deeply, admired his restless intellect. She often called him my angel, my dear guide, and the perfection of every virtue. Her love for him was both tender and reverent, so complete that his opinions became the mirror by which she measured her own. The people of Britain soon sensed that the monarchy had changed. The frivolous, scandalous court of earlier reigns gave way to something profoundly domestic. The royal family became the model of middle-class virtue. In portraits and engravings circulated throughout the empire, Victoria appeared surrounded by her children, her hand resting gently on Albert's arm, the air serene and orderly. For an age weary of aristocratic excess, this new image was a moral revelation. The monarchy had become respectable, yet the weight of public example was enormous. Victoria and Albert lived not for themselves, but as symbols of national virtue. Their private joys and quarrels played out under the gaze of millions. When their second child, Albert Edward, the future King Edward VII, was born in 1841, the celebrations were immense. Crowds filled the parks and streets, cheering as cannon fire echoed from the tower. But even in moments of joy, duty pressed upon them. The Queen resumed official audiences only days after childbirth, determined to prove her strength. She adored her son but fretted over her maternal instincts, writing, "I do not like babies. I am not a good nurse." Her honesty shocked courtiers, but it was a truth she would never disguise. Her love was deep, but not always gentle. The royal household grew swiftly. Within a decade, 9 children filled the nurseries of Windsor, Osborne, and Balmoral, each named for a virtue, each carefully educated under Albert's supervision. The prince insisted on simplicity and discipline. The children were to wake early, bathe in cold water, study geography and moral philosophy, and spend long hours outdoors. He despised the idle arrogance of aristocracy and wished his sons and daughters to be useful, upright citizens. Victoria often found his strictness excessive, but trusted his judgment. "The dear papa," she wrote, "knows what is right in all things." Their domestic life had a rhythm that charmed and astonished foreign observers. Breakfasts were cheerful, but modest, fresh bread, eggs, fruit, and tea. Afternoons were devoted to music, sketching, or family walks. Evenings brought reading aloud by the fire, Shakespeare, Tennyson, the poetry of Wordsworth. Sundays were sacred, filled with hymns and quiet reflection. The court, once notorious for gambling and scandal, now moved with the serenity of a well-tuned clock. The Queen's affection for Albert became the moral pulse of the realm, and in her love, the empire found its conscience. But outside the palace gates, Britain itself was changing beyond recognition. The hum of industry filled the air. The smoke of factories dimmed the sky. The hiss of steam engines replaced the clip-clop of horses, and iron bridges arched across rivers once lined with fishing boats. Cities grew swollen with workers, men, women, and children drawn from the countryside to the promise of wages and the peril of poverty. The Industrial Revolution was both miracle and tragedy. It forged wealth unprecedented in human history and misery equally vast. Albert, ever the reformer, was fascinated by its potential and troubled by its cost. He studied engineering, corresponded with industrial leaders, and pressed for laws to improve workers' conditions. He believed that progress must be guided by moral purpose. He saw the new factories not as mere engines of profit, but as the crucible of a new society. Victoria, though less analytical, shared his concern. When she read reports of child labour and urban squalor, she wrote in her journal of her sadness and frustration. "It is dreadful to think of the misery of so many of our subjects, and we live in such comfort." The 1,840 seconds tested their optimism. Economic depression struck, food prices rose, and unemployment bred unrest. The Chartist movement demanding universal male suffrage and political reform gathered strength. Mass meetings filled the streets, banners bearing slogans of equality and justice. The monarchy, distant and wealthy, became an easy target for anger. Yet, to the astonishment of many, Victoria remained popular. Her visible sincerity, her reputation for domestic virtue, and her evident devotion to the people's welfare shielded her from the bitterness directed at Parliament. Albert urged the Queen to see these agitations as the birth pains of a modern world, rather than threats to her crown. He believed in moral progress, the idea that human reason, guided by education, could lead to a just society. His mind was alive with projects: schools, libraries, public parks, sanitation systems. He saw the monarch not as ruler but as guardian, a symbol to inspire improvement. "We must educate our masters," he told Victoria, meaning the people. She admired his faith, but worried that too much reform would shake the old order. Between her reverence for tradition and his passion for progress, the Victorian equilibrium was born a delicate balance between change and continuity. Their partnership reached its most brilliant expression in the Great Exhibition of 1851. The idea was Albert's, an international fair to celebrate the triumphs of industry, science, and art. He envisioned it as a temple of human achievement, a showcase of peace through progress. The plan was audacious. Under his guidance, architect Joseph Paxton designed a colossal structure of glass and iron, the Crystal Palace, to rise in Hyde Park. It would house more than 100,000 exhibits from every corner of the globe. Victoria supported the project wholeheartedly. She visited the site often, watching the immense arches of glass panels being lifted into place. The newspapers called it Albert's Folly, but the public's curiosity grew. On the opening day, the 1st of May, 1851, more than 25,000 people filled the building. Light poured through the transparent roof, illuminating displays of machinery, textiles, scientific instruments, and art. The Queen walked beside Albert down the long central nave, overwhelmed by the sight. "It was," she wrote, "one of the greatest days of my life." The success was absolute. 6 million visitors, nearly a third of Britain's population, flocked to see the exhibition before it closed. Nations from Europe, America, and the colonies sent their finest inventions. It was a global celebration of human creativity, and its moral undercurrent was unmistakable. Here was the empire, not of conquest, but of collaboration. The profits funded new museums and educational institutions, among them the future Victoria and Albert Museum, a lasting monument to their shared vision. The Great Exhibition crowned Albert's career and elevated him from a figure of suspicion to one of admiration. For the first time, the British press hailed him as the Prince of Progress. Victoria was ecstatic. "My dearest Albert's name," she wrote, "will be immortalized in connection with the success of this undertaking." She saw in his triumph the vindication of all she had believed about love, partnership, and duty. Yet even amid this triumph, shadows lengthened. The strain of constant work, the pressure of perfection, and the unending scrutiny of public life began to take their toll. Albert's health, always delicate, showed signs of decline. He suffered from stomach pains and fatigue, symptoms of stress and overexertion. Victoria, alarmed, urged him to rest, but he pressed on. "We must not waste time," he told her. "There is so much to be done." At home, their children were growing, their personalities forming in the reflection of their parents' duality. The eldest, Vicky, inherited her father's intellect and moral earnestness. Bertie, the future Edward VII, was charming but indolent, a source of constant worry. "Bertie is very idle and careless," the Queen lamented. Albert, stern and loving, tried to mould the boy into his own image of virtue, but the distance between them widened. This tension, unhealed, would haunt Victoria long after Albert's death. Still, the rhythm of royal life continued, punctuated by the endless ceremonies of empire tours, banquets, audiences with ambassadors, openings of Parliament, The Queen and her prince travelled to Scotland, where they purchased Balmoral, a retreat of wild beauty amid the Highlands. There, among heather and mist, they found a refuge from the suffocating formality of court. They walked together for hours, rode horses through forests, and spoke freely without the constant presence of attendants. "Here," she wrote, "we are so happy, so peaceable and free." Balmoral became the spiritual centre of their marriage, a place where love and empire finally breathed the same air. By the early 1852, the Victorian Age was in full bloom. Industry, empire, morality, and domesticity had fused into a single vision of progress. London stood as the capital of the world, its skyline crowned with domes and chimneys, its streets alive with invention. Across the seas, British power stretched from Canada to India, from Africa to the Pacific. The telegraph shrank distances, railways bound continents, and the Queen's name became synonymous with stability. Yet even in these years of apparent perfection, Victoria's soul carried a hidden fragility. Her love for Albert was absolute, her dependence on him profound. She could not imagine life without his counsel, his steady gaze, his quiet voice in the evenings. "He is my existence," she once wrote. "Without him I cannot go on." In that devotion lay both her strength and her vulnerability. The same love that had made her reign radiant would, when tested by loss, plunge her into the deepest darkness of her life. For now, however, the world seemed secure. The bells of London rang for prosperity, the empire's banners flew proudly, and the royal couple's example illuminated a century hungry for virtue. Together, they had woven love into the fabric of empire, and the empire, in return, had woven their love into its legend. The Queen and the World's Fair. By 1851, the British Empire stood at the apex of confidence and ambition. The age was one of steam and steel, of soot-streaked skylines and ceaseless invention. In every corner of the earth, from the factories of Manchester to the shipyards of Bombay, the pulse of industry quickened beneath the watchful gaze of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. They were no longer the uncertain young couple of a decade past. Now they stood as the moral and symbolic heart of a realm that stretched across continents, a living emblem of order in an age of boundless change. The Great Exhibition, Albert's grand vision, was the perfect expression of this new world, a cathedral of progress built not of stone, but of glass and iron. It was his dream, and soon enough, her pride. The Queen's diary entry on the morning of its opening captured her awe. The huge building looked so beautiful, the sun shining through the glass, the immense crowds, the confusion, the music. It was the happiest, proudest day of my life. The Crystal Palace rose in the green heart of Hyde Park, its vast vault of glass glittering like a dewdrop in the spring light. Designed by Joseph Paxton, a Gardner architect whose imagination married practicality to beauty, it defied the traditional heaviness of public architecture. Where cathedrals had been built to worship God, this one seemed built to worship mankind's ingenuity. Inside stretched a nave, longer than street, Paul's Cathedral, filled with marvels that seemed drawn from the dreams of centuries. Every nation under Britain's imperial sun had sent its finest creations. There were engines polished to a mirror shine, looms and clocks, crystal chandeliers, and delicate china. Displays of textiles from India glowed with gold and crimson. French glasswork sparkled in the sunlight beside American agricultural machinery and the mechanical wonders of the German states. Visitors gasped at the sight of the Koh-i-Noor diamond, its cold brilliance refracting the morning into fire. They wandered through aisles that smelled of oil and varnish, of iron and perfume, and heard the hum of progress echoing through the hall like a hymn. When the Queen and her husband arrived for the opening ceremony on May 1st, 1851, more than 25,000 people filled the galleries and aisles. The band of the Coldstream Guards played God Save the Queen, and a cheer rolled through the glass cathedral like a wave. Victoria wore a gown of pale pink silk trimmed with lace. Albert, in his dark uniform, looked every inch the visionary prince. They walked together beneath the soaring arches, their faces glowing with quiet triumph. To Victoria, the exhibition was not merely an event, it was a vindication. The world had doubted Albert, mocked him as an over-serious foreigner, an interloper meddling in affairs beyond his station. But on that radiant morning, as the sun broke through the crystal roof and fell upon the smiling crowds, she felt his triumph as her own. "My dearest Albert's name," she wrote that evening, "is forever immortalized by this day." The exhibition became a pilgrimage for millions. 6 million visitors, rich and poor, from London and beyond, passed beneath the glittering roof during its 6 months of glory. Factory workers in Sunday clothes rubbed shoulders with noblemen. School children stared in awe at steam locomotives and telegraphs. Foreign dignitaries bowed before the modest queen whose nation seemed to command the future itself. The profits funded museums, colleges, and institutions of art and science that would nourish British intellect for generations. At night, when the exhibition emptied and the light faded from the glass, Victoria sometimes walked through its silent halls with Albert. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust, the last echoes of footsteps dying away. They would pause before the great machinery that symbolized mankind's growing dominion over nature, the spinning wheels, the printing presses, the enormous hydraulic cranes. "It is a wonder," Albert said once, "that man can make such things." She looked at him and replied softly, "And yet, it is you who has made this possible." Outside, London pulsed with prosperity. Gaslights flared along the streets, omnibuses rattled over the cobblestones, and factories spewed their nightly plumes into the fog. The city's expansion was astonishing. Suburbs crept outward, linked by new railways. London was the first true metropolis of the modern world, a city of wealth and want, elegance and squalor. The Queen's carriages rolled through it often, and though her presence was cheered by crowds, she could not ignore the faces of the poor who lined the streets. The success of the exhibition did not erase the grim contrasts of her age. The child labourers, the slums of Whitechapel, the cholera outbreaks that stalked the alleys like ghosts. Albert, ever the reformer, saw the exhibition as only a beginning. It had shown him the power of unity through industry, and he began to dream of broader reforms: improved housing, education for all classes, and a future where science would cleanse the city's filth and ignorance. He studied the new sewer systems being designed for London, supported the creation of parks, and championed the cause of public health. He believed civilization could be engineered as neatly as a clockwork mechanism. Victoria, though less technical, shared his belief in moral progress. She became more reflective, more aware of her symbolic role. In her letters, she began to speak of the crown not as personal privilege, but as sacred stewardship. "The world moves swiftly," she wrote, "and we must move with it, else we are left behind." But not all was harmony. For every cheer that greeted the Queen's carriage, there were murmurs of criticism. Some saw the exhibition as a boastful display of imperial arrogance. Radical voices argued that while machines glittered in Hyde Park, millions still lived in hunger. Newspapers printed caricatures of Her Industrious Majesty as a woman blinded by spectacle. Victoria, ever sensitive, felt each insult keenly, yet she faced them with increasing composure. The years had begun to harden her self-control into the calm authority that would become her legend. At home, her marriage remained the foundation of her strength. Albert's devotion was total, his moral compass unwavering. Together they raised their growing family with the same discipline they applied to government. Vicky, clever and articulate, charmed everyone she met. Bertie, restless and willful, caused endless concern. "He does not apply himself," Albert wrote sternly, "and I fear he will not be fit for the duties of a future king." The Queen adored her son but shared her husband's frustration. "Bertie tries one's patience beyond words," she confided in her diary. "But I must remind myself he is young, and perhaps too like me." Their domestic life at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight offered moments of peace. Albert had overseen its design himself, filling it with sunlight and soft colours, surrounded by gardens that descended to the sea. There, the Queen could escape the endless ceremonials of London and live, for a few days. As a wife and mother, she loved to paint watercolours of the children playing on the beach, of Albert reading beneath the trees, of the waves glittering in the late afternoon sun. "Here we are, truly ourselves," she wrote, "happy and tranquil." Balmoral, their Scottish retreat, offered another refuge. The rugged highlands, the scent of pine and heather, the solitude of mountains all gave them a sense of spiritual renewal. They rode together for hours through misty glens, the Queen in tartan skirts, Albert in Highland dress, the children chasing beside them. It was there, among the hills, that Victoria began to feel most connected to the land she ruled. "Scotland," she wrote, "is my dearest paradise on earth." But the world beyond their idyll was not still. The 1,850 seconds brought turbulence abroad and sorrow at home. In 1853, the Crimean War erupted, a brutal conflict fought between Russia and an uneasy alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. The war's distant thunder reached even Windsor's marble halls. Reports of freezing soldiers, inadequate supplies, and appalling medical conditions filled the newspapers. The public grew outraged, and the Queen, deeply moved, worked tirelessly to support the troops. She organised relief funds, visited hospitals, and corresponded personally with soldiers' families. Her compassion, genuine and maternal, helped restore some measure of trust between Crown and people. It was during this war that Florence Nightingale's name entered her awareness, the lady with the lamp, who tended wounded soldiers in the darkness of Scutari. Victoria admired her deeply, writing letters of gratitude and later helping to fund the reform of military nursing. "No one," she wrote, "has done more to prove the power of kindness." In these gestures, the Queen began to see herself not merely as ruler, but as moral mother of her nation. By the war's end, Britain emerged victorious, but sobered. The age of conquest was beginning to give way to an age of conscience. Albert, ever idealistic, saw this as confirmation of his faith in progress through reason. He believed diplomacy and science, not war, would define the future. Victoria, though proud of her army, found comfort in his pacifism. "We must," she said, "be an example to the world, not its scourge." The decade that followed was their golden Middle Age, a time of peace, prosperity, and purpose. The world admired them as the embodiment of unity. Monarchs across Europe envied the respect Victoria commanded. Her letters to foreign sovereigns, written in elegant, precise English, were as much instruments of diplomacy as treaties themselves. She was the grandmother of Europe in spirit long before she became so in blood. But even golden ages cast shadows. Albert's health continued to wane. The tireless pace of work, his anxiety over his children's futures, and his ceaseless sense of duty wore him down. He suffered from bouts of exhaustion, fever, and stomach pain. The Queen, ever devoted, grew fearful. "He works too much," she told her physician. "He cannot rest. He will not rest." Still, Albert pressed forward. "We are not here to idle," he told her gently. "We must do what we can while time is given to us." His dedication inspired her, but filled her with dread. The thought of life without him was unbearable. He had become her compass, her conscience, her constant light. The empire might have celebrated its machines, but for Victoria, the truest marvel of her age was the man who had built its moral foundation. And so, as the decade closed, the Queen stood at the summit of all she had dreamed. Wife, mother, empress, in all but title, beloved sovereign of a people who saw in her steadiness their own reflection. Yet even as the glass of the Crystal Palace gleamed in the sunlight of Britain's triumph, cracks invisible to the eye had begun to form, cracks of fatigue, of mortality, of love tested by time. The World's Fair had shown humanity's power to build wonders beyond imagination. Soon, Victoria would learn how fragile even the strongest structures could be when struck by the unseen hand of fate. Shadows in the palace. The world outside Buckingham Palace glowed with prosperity, invention, and the quiet rhythm of progress. But within the gilded chambers of the royal household, shadows had begun to stir. The Great Exhibition had crowned the mid-century in triumph, and yet, for all the music and machinery that sang of modern marvels, a weariness had taken root in the Queen's heart. Victoria was still young by royal standards, only in her early 30s, but she had already lived a lifetime of duty. She had borne 9 children, presided over the empire's grandest era, and embodied the moral conscience of her nation. But behind the smiles painted in portraits, the palace walls held the echo of fatigue, the strain of perfection, and the quiet friction between human fragility and the crown's unending weight. Albert, ever tireless, had grown increasingly grave. The success of the Crystal Palace had not brought him rest, but renewed purpose. His mind turned to education reform, industrial safety, and the modernization of the army. His study became a command center of papers and drafts, letters and plans, all stacked with the neatness of obsession. The lamp in his room burned late into the night, the scratching of his pen the only sound. Victoria admired him beyond measure, yet the sight of his constant toil filled her with unease. He was no longer the radiant young prince she had married. His face had grown pale, lined with worry, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. Their love remained fierce, but its nature had changed. It had matured into something more solemn, more absolute, yet also more fraught. Victoria depended on Albert as one depends on breath. He was her counsellor, her conscience, her anchor in a world that shifted faster each year. But this dependency, though born of love, sometimes bred tension. Albert's temperament was restrained, logical, and devout. Victoria's was impassioned, volatile, and deeply human. He sought reason, she sought feeling. He demanded control, she demanded closeness. The palace, so orderly in appearance, was alive with this subtle war between two natures, bound by affection, yet divided by temperament. Albert's sense of duty had grown to the point of asceticism. He lectured ministers on efficiency, criticised waste in the army, and drafted proposals for social housing. His conscience was vast, but merciless. He held himself to impossible standards and expected the same of others. Victoria often found herself caught between admiration and exhaustion. She would watch him pacing the room, papers in hand, his brow furrowed, and whisper in her diary, "He cannot stop. He knows no peace." Their children, too, began to feel the weight of this moral empire. The eldest, Vicky, inherited her father's intellect and ambition. Her education was rigorous, her manners precise. Albert adored her mind and often confided in her as if she were an adult. The heir, Bertie, by contrast, suffered under expectations he could not fulfill. He was affectionate, impulsive, and restless, a boy who preferred laughter to books, horses to history. Albert's disappointment in him was profound. "He will break his mother's heart," he once said quietly. Victoria defended her son, but secretly feared the same. "Bertie gives me endless anxiety," she wrote. "He is idle, careless, unreflecting." These family tensions blended with the mounting stress of governance. The empire was vast, its bureaucracy sprawling. Colonial administrators sent endless dispatches from India, Canada, Africa, and the Caribbean. Trade disputes flared, and the Crimean War left behind both pride and grief. Victoria wrote to soldiers' widows and wounded veterans, sending small gifts and words of comfort. Yet even her compassion could not shield her from the realization that her realm was held together by fragile human hands. The year 1855 marked a turning point. The Crimean conflict had revealed the inefficiencies of the army and the miseries of war. Albert threw himself into military reform, designing new rifles, studying fortifications, and advising on army discipline. His health, however, grew worse. Coughs lingered, fevers came and went, and still he refused rest. "The nation must come first," he told Victoria gently. She pleaded with him to slow down, but he would only smile faintly. "My love, there is no time for idleness." The Queen's concern deepened into fear. She began to dread the nights when he worked alone, the faint sound of his footsteps echoing through the halls. "He looks so thin, so pale," she confided in Lazen, her former governess. "I cannot bear it." The thought of losing him was unbearable, almost unthinkable. He was not only her husband, but her soul's equilibrium. Without him, she feared she might collapse under the weight of her crown. And yet, her love for Albert sometimes took on a possessiveness that strained their peace. She resented any influence that distracted him from her, the tutors, the ministers, even their own children. She longed for the days when their world had been small, when they had walked hand in hand at Osborne and laughed freely. But the palace, like the empire, allowed no retreat. Their correspondence, thousands of letters exchanged even when they were in the same house, reveals both tenderness and tension. "You are everything to me," she wrote, "but you are too noble, too good for this world." He answered kindly but firmly, "Dearest one, we must both remember our duty. Love does not free us from it, it gives us strength to bear it." It was a truth she accepted but did not love. Duty, to Victoria, was sacred, yet it always demanded sacrifice. And as the 1,850 seconds progressed, sacrifice became the defining note of her existence. The years of childbirth and governance took a toll on her body. She suffered from rheumatism and headaches, her once bright complexion fading under the strain of constant labour. The endless pregnancies, the demands of motherhood, and the monotony of state business left her exhausted. "I am so tired," she wrote in 1856. "So very tired. I long for peace, for quiet, for rest with my beloved one." But peace remained elusive. The world, meanwhile, seemed drunk on its own progress. Telegraph cables stretched across the seas. Steamships linked continents in weeks instead of months. The empire's dominions expanded, and so did the moral expectations of its queen. The British people, now more literate than ever, read of her every act and expression. To them, she was not only monarch but mirror, an embodiment of virtue, industry, and endurance. The angel of the hearth, as they called her, could not afford to falter, yet the angel was mortal. Albert's reforming zeal, once admired, began to isolate him. Politicians bristled at his criticism. Newspapers questioned his authority. Some accused him of meddling in matters beyond his station. The whispers reached Victoria, wounding her deeply. "They are ungrateful," she lamented. "He works for their good, and they cannot see it." In private, she scolded ministers, defending him with fiery loyalty. "No one knows what he does," she insisted. "Without him, I am nothing." But the strain showed. The couple's correspondence grew shorter, their exchanges more practical. The intimacy of earlier years was shadowed by fatigue. Victoria's mood swung between devotion and despair. Albert, though patient, sometimes withdrew into silence. He was burdened not only by politics but by the constant worry over Bertie's behaviour. The young prince, now nearing 20, had become the embodiment of his father's fears, charming, indolent, and too easily distracted by pleasure. In 1858, Bertie was sent to Cambridge to continue his studies, but soon rumours reached the palace of his flirtations and idle habits. Albert was mortified. "He must learn that pleasure without purpose is disgrace," he told Victoria. She wept as she read his letters to their son, stern, almost pleading. "Your father's heart," she wrote to Bertie herself, "is breaking over your conduct." The family's private troubles remained hidden from the public, but within the palace, the air grew heavy with worry. Amid these domestic strains, the empire's politics grew no gentler. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 shook the foundations of British rule. Reports of massacres and reprisals filled the newspapers, and the public's mood darkened. Victoria was horrified by the bloodshed on both sides. She mourned the loss of British lives, but also wrote, with rare sympathy, of the suffering of Indian families caught in the chaos. "It grieves me deeply," she said, "that such cruelty has stained the name of our nation. The rebellion's suppression led to the dissolution of the East India Company and the formal transfer of power to the British Crown. The Queen, though never having set foot in India, became its symbolic sovereign, a title that would one day be formalized as Empress. But for now, she saw only tragedy and the vastness of responsibility that lay before her. The late 1852 thus carried both glory and gloom. The world hailed the Victorian Empire as a wonder, yet within its palaces the seeds of personal sorrow were sprouting. Albert's health continued to wane. His coughs grew deeper, his strength weaker. He refused to rest, insisting that his duties as husband, father, and reformer outweighed all else. Victoria, terrified, hovered over him, arranging his meals, monitoring his hours, begging him to sleep. But the prince only smiled faintly, saying, "I cannot rest while there is so much unfinished." By 1860, his physicians were worried. Exhaustion, they said, a mind too active, a body too weary. But no one dared to command him to stop. Victoria's anxiety deepened into dread. She clung to him more fiercely than ever, sensing the shadow of an ending she could not name. "He is my life," she wrote, "my all, my soul. If I were to lose him, I should lose myself." In the quiet evenings at Windsor, they sometimes sat together by the fire, their children's laughter echoing faintly from distant rooms. The Queen would rest her head against his shoulder, listening to his calm voice as he spoke of the future, the need for reason, for moral education, for faith in humanity. She would close her eyes and think, not of the future, but of the fragile present, the ticking clock, the warmth of his hand. The shadows in the palace were lengthening. They fell softly across the marble floors and the polished mirrors, across the diaries where she poured out her fears, across the heart of an empire that still believed its queen's life was all light. Yet behind those windows, the glow of domestic perfection was dimming, flickering like a candle before the wind. The death of Albert. The winter of 1861 descended upon Windsor Castle with a heavy stillness, the kind that muffles every sound beneath the slow fall of snow. Within those grey walls, a silence lingered, not the calm of peace, but the suffocating hush of illness and dread. Prince Albert, the steady axis of Queen Victoria's life and of her reign itself, was dying. The man who had seemed tireless, whose mind had driven the machinery of reform, and whose heart had guided hers through every storm, now lay pale and weak in his bed. For weeks the Queen refused to believe it could be true. He had always recovered before, had always pushed through fevers and exhaustion by the sheer force of will. But this time, his strength was failing. It had begun in late autumn, with what seemed to be a simple chill. Albert had been overworking himself again, visiting military installations, studying reports on the nation's defences, and trying to manage the crisis of his son's behaviour. News had reached him of Bertie's latest scandal, a foolish liaison at an army camp in Ireland. The revelation pierced Albert to the core. It wasn't just moral disappointment, it was heartbreak, a sense that the ideals he had built his life upon were slipping through his fingers. "My poor boy," he said softly to Victoria. "He will ruin everything." The prince's health, already fragile, began to falter soon after. At first, the physicians called it a fever. Then, As the weeks passed and his strength did not return, they whispered of typhoid. The diagnosis was uncertain, the treatments primitive. The Queen hovered constantly by his bedside, dismissing courtiers and refusing to rest. She read to him in the evenings, adjusting his pillows, her voice trembling as she tried to keep her tone steady. "You must sleep, my dearest," she would say, smoothing his hair back from his damp forehead. "You will be well again soon." But Albert's face was drawn, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. His mind, still sharp, seemed to accept what his body could not. "I am very ill," he murmured one night, "but I have no fear of death." Victoria clutched his hand tightly, refusing to let him speak of such things. "No, no," she cried softly. "You must not leave me." He smiled faintly. "My dear one, I have worked long enough. You must carry on." Outside, the wind moaned through the turrets, and the fire in his room burned low. The royal children crept through the halls in silence, their faces pale with confusion and grief. The palace, once filled with the laughter of family and the hum of work, now felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. On December 14th, the snow fell in thick flakes across the grounds of Windsor. The air inside was heavy with the smell of medicine and candle wax. The doctors whispered in corners, the servants moved quietly, and the Queen refused to leave his side. Albert's breathing grew shallow, each breath a fragile thread holding him to the world. At 10 o'clock that night, as the lamps flickered, he turned his head slightly toward her. "I am so tired," he whispered. Those were the last words she ever heard him speak. When the stillness came, it was so complete that even the clock seemed to hesitate before striking the hour. Victoria pressed her face against his hand, which was already cooling. "No, no," she cried again. "My dearest, do not go. Stay with me." But there was only the sound of the wind, the low sobs of her daughters, and the tolling of the castle bell that announced to the world that the prince consort was dead. He was 42 years old. The Queen's cry echoed through the corridors of Windsor that night, a sound so raw that servants wept outside her door. She could not be comforted. "My life as a happy one is ended," she wrote the next morning. "The world is gone for me." Her children, bewildered and grieving, clung to her for strength, but she had none to give. "I am not fit to be left alone," she confessed. "He was my all in all." The nation, too, fell into mourning. When the news spread, church bells tolled across the empire, from London to Calcutta, from Cape Town to the Caribbean. Newspapers printed black borders, and portraits of the prince consort appeared draped in crape in every shop window. The man who had once been distrusted as a foreigner was now mourned as Britain's moral compass, the quiet architect of its modern age. In the days that followed, Victoria moved through her grief like a ghost. She dressed entirely in black and ordered the same for the household. Mirrors were covered, music silenced, and court entertainments cancelled indefinitely. She refused to appear in public, refused even to sit upon her throne. "I feel," she wrote, "as if half of myself were buried in the grave." Albert's room was preserved exactly as he had left it. His clothes remained folded upon the chair, his watch upon the table, his shaving water ordered daily, as though he might return at any moment. Each evening, she entered the room to kiss the pillow where his head had rested. The servants, out of love and pity, maintained the illusion that he still lived within those walls. The government grew anxious. A queen in mourning was a nation without its symbol. But Victoria could not be moved. Her grief was not merely personal, it was cosmic. In Albert she had seen her purpose, her faith, her reason for reigning. Without him, the world seemed meaningless. "I am all alone," she wrote to her eldest daughter. "My life is henceforth one of solitude." She withdrew to Windsor for months, then to Osborne, her beloved retreat on the Isle of Wight. The great palaces of London stood silent. Ministers visited occasionally, bowing low and murmuring their condolences, but her responses were brief, mechanical. She delegated authority to her eldest son and to her private secretaries. Letters from foreign monarchs, Napoleon III, Emperor Franz Joseph, even the Tsar of Russia poured in, but she scarcely read them. "I cannot bear to see anyone," she said. "The world's business is hateful to me." And yet, amid her despair, she found moments of strange clarity. She ordered a series of statues and memorials to be commissioned in Albert's honour, one at Windsor, another at Balmoral, and the greatest of all, the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, a vast Gothic monument that would take 2 decades to complete. "He must never be forgotten," she said. "His name must live when I am dust." But grief, when sustained too long, can become its own prison. As the months turned into years, her isolation deepened. The court, once a place of elegance and ceremony, became sombre and subdued. Ministers began to worry that her seclusion endangered the stability of the monarchy. The people, at first sympathetic, grew restless. Newspapers asked whether the Queen had abandoned her duty. Satirical prints showed an empty throne beneath a shrouded crown. Still, Victoria could not rejoin the world. The wound was too deep. "My heart is broken," she wrote. "The light has gone out of my life." Her children begged her to return to public life. Her Prime Minister urged her gently to appear before Parliament. "It would strengthen the nation," he said. She replied only, "The nation must do without me. I am a widow of Windsor." She found a strange comfort in ritual. Every morning she read passages from the Bible that Albert had loved. Every evening she wrote in her journal, as though he were still alive, describing her day in meticulous detail. She signed each entry, "Ever yours, devotedly, V.R." She even imagined that he guided her still, invisible but near, whispering wisdom into her heart. "He is not gone," she wrote once, "only away for a while. I feel him beside me when I walk, when I pray, when I sleep." The prince's death marked more than the loss of a husband. It was the death of an age of innocence. The world that Victoria and Albert had built together, an empire of virtue, progress, and moral certainty, began to tremble beneath the weight of reality. The industrial world they had celebrated grew harsher and more complex. Wars and social upheaval loomed on the horizon. The domestic paradise that had defined their marriage now seemed like a dream dissolving in grief. The Queen's mourning attire became her armour. She would wear black for the rest of her life. For 40 years, no one would see her in colour again. It was as though she had buried not only her husband, but the very sunlight of her youth. "Life is but a long night now," she said to her daughter Alice. And yet, in that darkness, something enduring began to take shape. Her sorrow, absolute and unwavering, became a kind of sacred emblem to her people. They saw in her mourning not weakness but loyalty, not despair but devotion. The widow's veil became a crown of virtue. The image of the grieving Queen touched hearts across classes and continents. She had lost her beloved, but in losing him, she had become immortal in her people's eyes. The candlelight flickered across Albert's untouched chamber for years after his passing. The air was always faintly scented with lavender, the same fragrance he had favoured. Visitors to Windsor spoke in whispers, as though entering a church. On quiet nights, when the corridors were empty and the castle clock struck the hour, servants swore they could hear her soft footsteps pause outside his door. Sometimes she entered, alone, closing it gently behind her. There, before the portrait of the man she called her dear angel, she would kneel, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. Outside those walls, the empire moved on. The locomotives still thundered, the factories still burned, and the ships of Britain still ruled the seas. But within Windsor Castle, time itself had stopped on that December night. The young Queen of Light had become the widow of shadows, her heart a monument to a love that had once bound together not just 2 souls, but an entire age. The widow of Windsor. The great bells of the empire tolled in mourning for Prince Albert through the winter of 1861, but the sound never ceased in Victoria's heart. The woman who had once been the radiant centre of Britain's golden age now withdrew from the world that had adored her. Curtains were drawn across the palace windows, mirrors covered with black cloth, and laughter extinguished in every hall. The throne stood empty, the court dismissed, the state receptions and banquets dissolved into memory. The Queen had died in spirit with her husband and re-emerged only as a mourner, the widow of Windsor. Her grief was absolute. A cathedral of sorrow she entered and never truly left. She ordered Albert's rooms at Windsor to remain exactly as they were. His clothes hung neatly in his wardrobe, his razors laid out each morning, his linen changed as though he would return. The servants obeyed these strange rituals without question, their hearts aching for their queen. Each day she would visit the chamber, pressing her lips to his pillow, whispering as if to someone still present. "My beloved," she would say softly, "I live only to do your will." Victoria's mourning became the rhythm of her existence. She wore black every day for the next 40 years, a symbol of devotion so unyielding that it turned into legend. The jet jewellery she favoured glinted faintly against her pale skin, the dark lace of her veils trailing behind her like mist. She slept surrounded by his portraits and mementos, his letters laid upon her nightstand. Even in her prayers, his name was invoked as though sanctified. "He is with God," she wrote, "and yet he is with me." The people, at first, were moved by her grief. They admired her fidelity and shared in her mourning. For a time, the nation seemed united in compassion, but months turned to years, and her withdrawal grew total. She rarely appeared in London. The windows of Buckingham Palace remained shuttered, the halls silent. Ministers travelled to Windsor or Osborne to conduct affairs of state, waiting hours for audiences in dim rooms where the Queen spoke in whispers and wore no colour. Her absence became a political crisis. Britain, an empire that now spanned the globe, needed its sovereign visible, not invisible. The prime ministers of the day, Palmerston, then Russell, and later Disraeli, pleaded for her to rejoin public life. She listened politely, then dismissed them with tears. "I cannot," she said simply. "It would be cruel to appear joyful when my heart is dead." But the nation's patience was not endless. Newspapers began to criticize her seclusion, describing her as a shadow queen. Satirical prints mocked the recluse of Balmoral and questioned whether she had abandoned her throne. Some even whispered of republicanism. "We have a monarchy without a monarch," one headline declared. The same people who had once cheered her carriage now wondered if she loved her grief more than her duty. And yet, even in her exile, she worked. Each morning she rose at 6 and spent long hours reading dispatches, signing papers, and corresponding with ministers. Her handwriting filled hundreds of pages each week, her mind still alert despite her sorrow. She ruled not from public stage, but from the solitude of her study. The fountain of her energy was not ambition, but devotion to the idea that her husband still guided her from beyond. She often referred to Albert as my invisible companion. When making decisions, she would pause, close her eyes, and whisper, "What would he have done?" In time, the rituals of mourning gave structure to her days. She divided her time between Windsor, Osborne, and Balmoral. Windsor was sacred ground, the place of his death, her shrine of grief. Osborne offered quieter solace, a home filled with memories of their family's laughter by the sea. Balmoral, in the Scottish Highlands, became her sanctuary. There, among the misty hills and roaring rivers, she felt closest to him. "He loved these mountains," she wrote. "I hear his voice in the wind that moves across the heather." It was at Balmoral that a new figure quietly entered her life, John Brown, a Scottish servant with rough manners and honest devotion. Brown had been a gillie, a Highland attendant, during Albert's visits, and had earned the prince's trust. After Albert's death, Victoria took comfort in his blunt loyalty and plain speech. He treated her not as a monarch but as a person, often scolding her gently for neglecting her health. "You must walk, Your Majesty," he would say. "The air will do you good." She obeyed, grateful for the first voice that dared to speak to her without ceremony. The bond between queen and servant scandalized the court. Rumours spread of impropriety, of secret affections. Newspapers referred to her mockingly as Mrs. Brown. The whispers pained her deeply, but she refused to dismiss him. "He has been my best friend," she wrote, "and I will not hear a word against him." Brown's presence, though humble, was transformative. He restored to her a faint spark of human warmth. In his straightforward company, she could forget the suffocating etiquette of court life and breathe again. Yet, even with Brown's companionship, she never ceased to mourn Albert. Her letters, numbering in the thousands to ministers, relatives, and foreign dignitaries, were saturated with references to "my blessed one." She carried his image wherever she went, his miniature portrait pinned to her breast, his handkerchief folded in her pocket. On the anniversaries of his birth and death, she locked herself away for hours in prayer and tears. "The agony returns always the same," she confessed. "Time brings no healing, only endurance." Despite her reclusion, the empire did not falter. Industry expanded, colonies multiplied, railways and telegraphs connected the world in a web of steel and light. But the monarchy's image darkened. Without her presence at public ceremonies, loyalty began to shift toward politicians. The press, emboldened by the spread of literacy, questioned her usefulness. Some radicals proposed replacing the monarchy altogether. Yet even as her popularity waned, affection for her never disappeared entirely. The people's criticism was edged with concern, not malice. She had, after all, become a mirror of their own endurance, an aging nation's grieving heart. The 1,860 seconds passed like a long twilight. She endured the loss of her mother in 1861, and, a few years later, her half-sister. Death had become her constant companion. "I live in a house of mourning," she said. "The shadows follow me everywhere." Her children grew into adulthood, their marriages scattering them across Europe. Vicky, the eldest, became Crown Princess of Prussia. Alice married into Hesse. Bertie wed Princess Alexandra of Denmark in 1863, though even that joyous occasion was haunted by Albert's absence. "How he would have loved to see this day," she whispered as she watched her son exchange vows. Her relationship with Bertie remained strained. She could not forgive the scandal that had so wounded Albert's last months. She wrote to him with icy formality, addressing him as the Prince of Wales, rarely as "my dear son." "Your conduct," she told him once, "was the cause of the greatest sorrow of my life." He, in turn, felt crushed beneath her judgment, retreating into his own pleasures. Their distance would last for decades, and yet, in public matters, Victoria remained exacting. Her correspondence with Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli in the 1,870 seconds revealed the slow rekindling of her political spirit. Disraeli, a man of imagination and flattery, understood how to reach her heart. He spoke to her of empire in poetic terms, describing her as Empress of half the world. His charm coaxed her out of her long silence. "He treats me like a woman," she once said, "not merely as a sovereign." Under his encouragement, she began to resume public appearances, her veil still black, but her presence once more commanding. When she finally appeared again in public in 1866, 5 years after Albert's death, the streets of London erupted in cheers. The people wept to see her carriage pass, draped in mourning but radiant with dignity. "God bless our Queen!" they shouted, and she bowed her head, tears glimmering behind her veil. For the first time since that December night, she felt the warmth of her people's love again. "It touched me deeply," she wrote. "I am not forgotten." Slowly, she began to govern with renewed steadiness. The grief never left her, it never would, but it settled into something she could live beside. The widow of Windsor became a symbol of constancy, a reminder that strength could exist within sorrow. The woman who had once wept alone at Albert's bedside now commanded an empire larger than any the world had ever known. Yet, in her private hours, the shadows remained. She spoke to Albert's portrait before bed, kissed his image each morning, and wrote his name until the end of her days. Her love had outlasted flesh, time, and reason. It had become her faith. The Queen, who had once embodied vitality and modernity, had transformed into something deeper, a living monument of devotion. The world might change, the empire might grow, but within Windsor's grey walls, the clock of her heart had stopped on the night of the 14th of December, 1861. And there, among the endless corridors of silence and memory, the widow of Windsor kept vigil, still mourning not only her husband, but the life that had once been hers, and the century that had died with him. Empire without end. In the decades that followed Albert's death, Queen Victoria's private sorrow became interwoven with the vast public tapestry of empire. Her seclusion had softened, but her mourning never lifted. The black veil became not only a symbol of grief, but an emblem of enduring authority, a mark of solemn constancy in a world that refused to stand still. The 19th century surged forward around her like an unstoppable tide, railways stitching continents together, telegraph lines binding oceans with threads of copper, new colonies rising under the Union Jack. Even as she retreated behind the walls of Windsor and Balmoral, her name travelled farther than any monarch's in history. The sun did not set upon her dominions, and in every distant corner of the world, from the dusty plains of India to the frozen frontiers of Canada, her portrait hung in government offices, churches, and schools, a reminder of the power that flowed from a single, grieving widow. The empire she ruled had grown into something unimaginable when she first took the throne. At her coronation, Britain had been a European kingdom with scattered colonies. Now it was a global network of trade, conquest, and influence that spanned 1/5 of the Earth's surface. Merchant ships filled every sea lane, carrying coal, cotton, sugar, tea, and the invisible weight of dominion. The navy, vast and disciplined, patrolled the oceans like an iron halo around her crown. London had become the beating heart of a world civilization, its docks crowded with goods from every hemisphere. Victoria viewed this expansion with a mixture of pride and awe. In her journals, she often referred to the glory of the empire and saw in its scale a reflection of divine providence. Yet her understanding of it remained largely symbolic. She saw herself as the mother of her people, protector of progress, and guardian of Christian virtue. The darker realities, the violence of colonization, the suffering of the conquered, the greed that drove expansion, were filtered through the idealized lens of her ministers. To her mind, Britain brought light to darkness, civilization to barbarism. It was a comforting illusion, one shared by much of her generation. Her relationship with India, the brightest jewel in her imperial crown, grew especially significant. The horrors of the 1857 rebellion had left deep scars on both sides, but they also bound the fate of the subcontinent more tightly to her own. When the British Parliament formally dissolved the East India Company and transferred control to the Crown, India became her direct dominion. The Queen's government replaced corporate rule, and though she never set foot there, she felt a profound connection to it. In her proclamation of 1858, she addressed her beloved subjects in India with words that resonated across the world. We hold ourselves bound to the natives of our Indian territories by the same obligations of duty which bind us to all our other subjects. It was the language of benevolence masking the mechanics of power, but to Victoria, it was heartfelt. She truly believed herself a mother to millions she would never see. The Indian princes sent her gifts of jewels, silks, and carved ivory. She studied their letters, delighted in their titles, and filled her diary with references to my Indian empire. In the evenings, she sometimes examined the glittering stones in her collection, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, the emeralds and rubies from Mysore, and reflected on the immensity of her realm. "I feel," she wrote once, "a deep responsibility, as though the souls of all these peoples were placed in my care." It was an image she clung to, Victoria as a moral empress rather than a conqueror. At home, the empire transformed the fabric of daily life. Tea from Ceylon, spices from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and cotton from Egypt filled British homes. The empire's wealth poured into the cities, building grand avenues and palaces of commerce. Yet for the poor, the industrial world remained hard. Slums grew in the shadows of prosperity. Child labour persisted in factories and mines. The contrast between wealth and misery widened like a wound, but the monarchy's moral influence remained a stabilising force. In the public imagination, Victoria's piety and restraint embodied the virtues that justified empire: discipline, faith, endurance. By the 1872, she had become less an individual and more a national idea. Her face appeared on coins, postage stamps, and medals. Her image hung in town halls and railway stations, in remote outposts of Africa and the Pacific. Travellers spoke of encountering her likeness in the most unlikely places: a faded engraving in a trader's hut, a small bust in a colonial governor's study, a portrait gazing down from a mission school's wall. For millions who would never meet her or hear her voice, she was the empire itself, distant, dignified, eternal. Yet behind that monumental image was a woman still haunted by loss. Every morning she opened her eyes to the same ritual: Albert's portrait above her bed, his clothes still laid out by attendants, his letters reread until the ink faded from the page. Even in the affairs of empire, she invoked his spirit. "He would have rejoiced in this," she wrote after the British victory in Abyssinia in 1868. "He would have advised me how best to reward the brave." Her children and ministers humoured her reverence, though it sometimes slowed the business of government. Her correspondence with her eldest daughter, Vicky, now Crown Princess of Prussia, became her lifeline to the wider world. They wrote almost daily, exchanging thousands of letters over the years, discussing politics, art, and family matters. Through Vicky, Victoria watched the unification of Germany under Otto von Bismarck, a process that filled her with both pride and fear. Her beloved daughter had married into a nation that would soon rival Britain's power. Yet she saw in her grandchildren among them the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, the intertwining of Europe's royal houses. "We are all one family," she wrote, "and peace must surely follow." She could not yet see how those same bloodlines would one day divide the world in war. In 1870, when France fell to Prussia and Napoleon III was overthrown, Victoria's sympathies were deeply conflicted. She admired the German efficiency that Albert had long praised, yet she grieved for France, that brilliant and wounded nation. "The balance of Europe is changing," she wrote. "I pray that Britain may remain the island of order amid the madness of men." Her instincts were conservative. She feared revolution, despised extremism, and distrusted the noisy politics of the new age. Her reign, she believed, was a divine trust, a steady light in an age of turbulence. Her friendship with Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli helped lift her from years of melancholy. Disraeli, with his dramatic eloquence and flowery compliments, understood her heart better than any statesman before or after. He called her the Fairy Queen, told her she ruled over a larger dominion than the Caesars, and spoke to her as though she were both goddess and confidant. "He knows how to talk to a woman," she once confessed. Under his influence, she began to emerge from the shadows of widowhood and into the splendour of imperial matriarchy. Disraeli's grandest gesture came in 1876, when he proposed that Victoria be formally proclaimed Empress of India. It was both a political manoeuvre and a symbolic coronation of the empire's maturity. The title appealed to her deeply. Empress captured the majesty she felt for her dominion and the pride she felt in its people. It was also, privately, an homage to Albert, he who had always urged her to embrace the future boldly. On May 1st, 876, amid ceremonies and proclamations, she became Victoria, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and of the colonies and dependencies thereof in Europe, Asia, Africa, America, and Australasia, Queen, Defender of the Faith, Empress of India, the world celebrated. The British press lauded the grandeur of the new title, and in India, festivals and illuminations marked the event. Though critics muttered that the title was vanity, to Victoria it was sacred recognition of a role she already felt she possessed. "It is what my beloved would have wished," she wrote. He saw the empire as one family under Providence. Her fascination with India deepened. She studied Hindustani, learned phrases in Urdu, and collected books on its history and art. Indian servants were brought to her household, including Abdul Karim, a young clerk from Agra who arrived in 1887 and soon became her trusted attendant. She delighted in his company, calling him the Munshi, meaning teacher. Under his guidance, she practiced the language daily, writing simple notes and reading translated poetry. To her, he represented a living bridge to the distant subjects she longed to understand. The court, however, bristled at his presence. They whispered of undue influence, of impropriety, of favouritism. Ministers fretted that the Queen's affection for the young Indian might embarrass the crown. But Victoria ignored them. She saw in Karim not scandal but sincerity, a spark of human connection in a world of protocol. "He is gentle, honest, and devoted," she wrote. "I learn much from him of the true India, not the one ministers describe." Her friendship with him scandalized society, but humanized her empire. It revealed, perhaps for the first time, her genuine curiosity about the lives beyond her palaces. While her personal world filled with these quiet relationships, the empire thundered forward. British troops fought in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. New territories were claimed, protectorates established. The British flag rose over Egypt in 1882, and the empire's frontiers reached the peaks of the Himalayas and the deserts of Sudan. Victoria followed these events closely, reading every dispatch and weeping for the fallen. "I cannot bear," she wrote, "that brave men die so far away." Her identification with her soldiers became almost maternal. She sent them medals, signed letters of condolence, and kept their regimental banners in her halls. As the years passed, the Queen aged into an almost mythic figure. Her once vibrant face softened into solemn gravity, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote, her steps slowed but still dignified. She lived surrounded by photographs of her descendants, now scattered across Europe's thrones. Kings of Greece, queens of Spain, emperors of Germany and Russia, all her grandchildren. Her blood ran through the veins of an entire continent. Statesmen called her the grandmother of Europe, though the title held irony as well as affection. Beneath the web of family ties, rivalries simmered, but she refused to see it. "My children," she said, "must not quarrel. They are all of one home." At home, her people's affection deepened again. Her long mourning, once criticised, came to symbolize steadfastness. The public saw in her endurance a mirror of their own, the perseverance of the Victorian middle class through hardship, loss, and duty. Her image softened into that of a kindly matron, wise and compassionate. When she celebrated her Golden Jubilee in 1887, 50 years on the throne, the celebrations were unlike anything the world had seen. Processions of colonial troops from every corner of the empire marched through London's streets, their bright uniforms reflecting the sunlight of a June morning. From her carriage, Victoria gazed upon them with tears in her eyes. "They have all come for me," she wrote, "for me and for him." The empire seemed eternal that day, a living map of red stretching across the globe, all under her name. But even as the cheers echoed through the city, faint cracks ran beneath the surface. Industrial unrest, the rise of socialism, and the stirrings of independence in the colonies whispered of change. The Queen, wise with age, sensed it but could not comprehend its depth. "The world moves too fast," she confessed. "Sometimes I feel as though it races away without me." Still, she clung to her duty with unwavering resolve. Every morning, she worked until her eyes blurred. Every evening, she prayed for her people and for the peace of the empire. Her faith remained her anchor. "The Lord has placed me here," she said, "and until he calls me home, I shall not cease to serve." And so she reigned no longer the young woman who had taken the throne amid doubt and speculation, but an institution unto herself, her sorrow transfigured into majesty. The empire she presided over seemed without end, stretching beyond the horizon of her own mortality. Yet in the quiet moments of her nights, as she looked upon Albert's portrait and the darkened expanse beyond her window, she knew that even empires fade, and that the heart beneath the crown still beat with human frailty. In her solitude, she had learned the hardest truth of all, that power endures not through conquest, but through endurance, through faith, and through love that defies even death. And though the empires of men might crumble, the image of the widow of Windsor mourning yet unbroken would remain, her name woven forever into the fabric of the world she helped to shape, the Empress of India. The title came to her as a whisper of glory wrapped in the slow pomp of empire, Empress of India. It was not a name she had chosen for vanity, though her critics thought so. It was the final act of devotion to Albert's memory and his vision of a moral empire. It was the culmination of everything that had been built in her name since that first trembling morning when she took the throne. It crowned not merely a reign, but an age, binding the destiny of Britain to lands that shimmered far beyond the western horizon. When Victoria became Kaiser-i-Hind, as the Indian princes would call her, she was already the longest ruling monarch her people had ever known. A woman transformed from youthful queen to a living monument. It was Benjamin Disraeli who had planted the idea in her mind. He understood how symbols shaped nations, how a word could transform a crown into a legend. In 1876, amid the proud hum of the British Raj, he proposed that the Queen be declared Empress of India. It would affirm Britain's supremacy after the annexations and revolts of the previous decades, and give Victoria a title to match her continental counterparts, the Tsar of Russia, the Emperor of Germany. Yet Disraeli, ever the poet in politics, presented it to her not as strategy, but as destiny. "The title," he said, "will unite your name with the greatest of your dominions. It will proclaim to the world that your empire is no accident of conquest, but the design of Providence." For Victoria, whose imagination was still coloured by the grandeur of Albert's dreams, the title struck a sacred chord. She thought of her late husband's fascination with India, the jewels he had admired at the Great Exhibition, his insistence that Britain's mission must be one of enlightenment, not exploitation. Becoming empress felt like fulfilling his prophecy. "It is what he would have wished," she wrote. "He always saw the empire as a great family, and I, its mother." The formal proclamation was made with due magnificence. Across the empire, soldiers fired salutes, church bells rang, and processions wound through the streets of Calcutta, Bombay, and Delhi. In London, the ceremony was solemn, the Queen dressed in mourning black as always, her face pale beneath her veil. She stood in the throne room of Windsor Castle while her ministers read the declaration. "We do by our royal proclamation," it said, "assume the title of Victoria, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Queen, Defender of the Faith, Empress of India." The words carried across the globe, echoed in 1,000 tongues, printed in every newspaper, and posted in every colonial office. In India, British officials read the proclamation aloud beneath a sun that never seemed to set. The people listened with curiosity or indifference. For most, it changed nothing in the rhythms of life and rule. But for Victoria, it was transcendent. "To think," she wrote, "that so many millions now belong to me, that their hopes and prayers rise with my name, it is a heavy burden, yet a holy one." From that moment onward, India became her empire not only in law but in imagination. She devoured books on its geography, art, and religion. She read translations of the Bhagavad Gita, studied sketches of Mughal palaces, and examined the portraits of Indian princes sent to her court. The treasures of the subcontinent fascinated her: silks that shimmered like water, carved ivory boxes, gemstones of impossible depth and clarity. She adored them not as spoils of conquest, but as tokens of connection, as proof that her sovereignty extended across the world's diversity. "How beautiful is the work of these people," she wrote. "So delicate and full of grace, one cannot but love them." Her fascination deepened into a kind of spiritual curiosity. In the 1,880 seconds, she took to learning Hindustani, encouraged by her Indian attendants, who served her at Osborne House and Balmoral. They addressed her reverently as Maharani Sahib. She practiced writing the script, slowly tracing its elegant loops with a gold pen, delighting when her tutor praised her progress. "I know a little of the language of my Indian subjects," she told her daughter, "and it pleases them greatly." The most significant of these attendants was Abdul Karim, a young clerk from Agra who arrived in 1887 to serve at her Golden Jubilee. Tall, dark-eyed, and modest, he quickly captured the Queen's attention with his dignity and intelligence. Within months, she made him her personal secretary for Indian affairs, her munshi, or teacher. He taught her phrases, recited poetry, and shared stories of his homeland. The Queen found in him a new affection, gentle and almost maternal. "He is so clever," she wrote. "He brings me news of my dear India, and I understand so much more through him." Developed prose. The court was scandalized. Ministers muttered about impropriety. Courtiers whispered about the Queen's infatuation. They complained that Karim was arrogant, that he meddled in matters beyond his station, that he was exploiting her affection. The racial prejudice of the age fueled their disdain, but Victoria, stubborn as ever, defended him fiercely. "He is a good and faithful man," she declared. "I will not have him insulted." When her private secretary attempted to remove Karim from her household, she exploded in fury. "If anyone dares to interfere with my Indian servants," she wrote, "they shall answer to me." Her relationship with the Munshi, though innocent, reflected something profound: her yearning for warmth and authenticity amid the cold machinery of empire. Surrounded by protocol and politics, she found in Karim a reminder of humanity beyond the formal world of courts. Through him, she glimpsed the faces behind the empire's statistics, the millions of subjects whose names she would never know. It softened her vision, even as her government continued to tighten its grip on India's economy and culture. Yet the crown of Empress carried a paradox she never acknowledged. While Victoria imagined herself as benevolent guardian, the British Raj grew harsher under her reign. Famines struck the land, claiming millions of lives. Taxes rose to fund railways and wars, and Indian voices that called for self-rule were silenced or ignored. The Queen read of these tragedies in sanitized reports that emphasized order, not suffering. "It grieves me," she wrote vaguely, "to hear of the distress in India. I trust that my government will do all that is possible to alleviate it." Her compassion was genuine but distant, filtered through the gauze of empire's illusions. Even at home, her title of Empress changed the tone of her monarchy. The word carried a sense of grandeur beyond constitutional limits, a suggestion of divine ordination. Victoria revelled in its dignity. Her correspondence, already voluminous, now bore the imperial signature, V.R.I., Victoria Regina et Imperatrix. Her seal impressed those letters upon decrees, medals, and treaties that spanned the globe. The monarchy, which had once been nearly obsolete, was now a unifying symbol of empire, a golden thread connecting colonies and dominions into a single imagined family. But the grandeur of empire could not hide the loneliness of the woman who embodied it. Her children were grown, her grandchildren scattered across Europe's royal houses. Her eldest daughter, the Empress of Germany, wrote of politics and culture with a sharpness that sometimes wounded her. Her son, Bertie, the Prince of Wales, lived a life of endless social engagements and whispered scandals. Victoria's distrust of him lingered. She saw in his easy charm the opposite of Albert's moral rigour. "He thinks too little, he plays too much," she complained. "He will never understand the burdens of responsibility." Still, she loved him in her own conflicted way. When he fell ill in 1871 with typhoid, the same disease that had taken Albert, she was frantic. She rode in the snow to his bedside, sat for hours holding his hand, and prayed with desperation. When he recovered, she wept openly. "It was as if my dear one were returned to me," she said. That Christmas, the nation celebrated her son's survival as a miracle. Churches filled with hymns of thanksgiving, and crowds gathered to cheer outside the palace. The public's affection, once doubtful, returned with fervour. "Our dear Queen," the newspapers wrote, "has suffered as we have suffered. She is truly one of us." By the time she reached her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, 60 years on the throne, Victoria was more than a monarch. She was a living relic of a century. She was 80 years old, her body frail but her will unbroken. Her Jubilee procession in London was a spectacle unlike any the world had seen. Representatives from every colony marched before her, Canadians in scarlet tunics, Indian soldiers in turbans, Africans in dress uniforms adorned with gold braid. The streets were draped in bunting, the air thick with music and incense, the cheers of millions swelling like a tide. From her carriage, the Queen gazed out with eyes clouded by age and tears. "No one," she wrote that night, "has ever been loved so much as I have been today." The Diamond Jubilee marked not just her endurance but the Empire's apogee. It was a moment of almost mythic unity, when Britain believed itself eternal. The phrase "the sun never sets on the British Empire" was more than a boast, it was creed, and at its heart sat the widow in black, smiling faintly beneath her veil, her gloved hand raised in trembling acknowledgement. To her people, she was the embodiment of faith, family, and stability. To the world beyond, she was both symbol and shadow of imperial dominion. Yet, beneath the pageantry, her heart remained anchored to the past. In the quiet of her chambers, she still wrote nightly in her journal, addressing Albert as if he might read her words across the veil. "My beloved," she wrote on her 61st wedding anniversary, "it has been so long since I heard your voice, but I feel you near. I have done my best as you would have wished." As the century waned, so too did her strength. Her health faltered, her eyesight dimmed, and her steps slowed to a shuffle supported by canes. The world she had known as a young queen was vanishing around her steamships, giving way to telegraphs, horses replaced by motor cars, gaslights yielding to electricity. She marvelled at the inventions of her time, but they filled her with unease. "It is wonderful," she said once of the telephone, "but it frightens me." Still, she remained steadfast in her faith and duty. She continued to meet with ministers, sign dispatches, and receive dignitaries from across the world. Foreign rulers came to pay homage: the German Kaiser, her grandson, the Tsar of Russia, her nephew, the King of Siam, her distant admirer. They bowed before her as before a matriarch of time itself. To the very end, she saw herself as servant of both God and empire. Her reign had seen triumphs and tragedies, but its continuity had become the moral anchor of the age. "We have changed the world," she wrote near her last birthday, "and yet the heart remains the same. Love, duty, and faith they endure." She could not know that within 2 decades of her death, the empire she had ruled would begin to unravel, torn by wars and revolutions. But perhaps it is better she did not. In her final years, she rested in the illusion she had built, that the empire was a family, that progress was peace, and that her own endurance had secured eternity. The woman who had been a princess of obscurity, a child of loneliness, a young queen of promise, and a widow of grief, now reigned over a world that had grown beyond comprehension. She had become both monarch and myth, both symbol and soul of her century, when she signed her final letters as Victoria R.I. The title carried all the weight of the world she had built, Regina et Imperatrix, Queen and Empress. And though her empire stretched to the ends of the earth, she remained, at her core, the same woman who had once knelt beside Albert's bed, whispering love to the silence that followed. The empire would continue to march forward in her name, its banners red against the sun, its ships bound for every port, its subjects numbering in the hundreds of millions. Yet the woman who had given it her heart would fade slowly into the shadows of time, her black veil blending at last with the twilight of the age she defined. Reawakening of a queen. The years after Victoria's elevation to Empress of India might have seemed, to those who watched her from afar, like the closing movement of a long, solemn symphony, a life wrapped in twilight and memory. Yet, within the vast stillness of her later reign, something subtle began to stir. It was not joy, for she would never again know the innocent brightness of that, nor was it ambition, which had long since burned itself away. It was something quieter and deeper, a reawakening of the spirit, a slow rekindling of engagement with the living world after decades of grief. For nearly 20 years after Albert's death, Victoria had moved through life as if under glass. Her existence had been ritualized mourning, the black dresses, the sealed rooms, the endless letters to her dead husband, written in a trembling hand. She had retreated from her people, from her city, from the pageantry of monarchy itself, and yet, despite the self-imposed solitude, her sense of duty had never died. It had merely sunk deep within her, buried beneath layers of sorrow. The empire expanded, governments rose and fell, inventions transformed society, and through it all, she remained a distant yet enduring presence, unchanging, untouchable, eternal. But as the 1,870 seconds and 1,880 seconds unfolded, time itself began to soften her isolation. Her children grew into maturity, her grandchildren began to populate Europe's royal families, and the empire's demands grew too vast to ignore. Ministers pressed her to re-emerge, not merely as a sovereign who signed papers from afar, but as the living symbol her people craved. The monarchy must be seen, one of her advisers told her gently. You are its heart. And somewhere within her, Albert's voice seemed to echo the same counsel. Be steadfast, my love. Do not let sorrow make you small. The slow thaw began, as so many of her renewals did, in Scotland. Balmoral had always been her refuge, a place where formality melted into nature, where the air smelled of pine and peat smoke, and the sky stretched clear over the heathered hills. There she could walk unescorted, ride through the glens, and speak plainly to the villagers, who greeted her not as Your Majesty, but as the good lady. The mountains, stern and eternal, soothed her. Here, she wrote, I feel near to him and to God. John Brown remained her most trusted companion through these years, his bluntness and earthy humour cutting through her melancholy. He guarded her fiercely, fending off gossip and intrusion. To many in the court he seemed insufferable, too free, too familiar, but to Victoria he was a lifeline. She relied on his strength, his simplicity, and his unshakable loyalty. When courtiers whispered that her friendship with a commoner disgraced the crown, she silenced them with icy authority. He is faithful, she declared, and faithfulness is a virtue I prize, above all. Brown's death in 1883 struck her like another blow from fate's merciless hand. She mourned him with the same intensity that had defined all her loves. In her diary, she wrote, The void he leaves is too dreadful, too dreadful. Another light has gone out of my life. She commissioned a statue of him to stand among Albert's memorials, despite the protests of her family. "He served me well," she said simply. "That is all that matters." And yet, as if grief itself had become the strange forge of her endurance, the loss of Brown did not plunge her back into the abyss. Instead, something in her seemed to harden into resolve. She was older now, well past 60, and her body no longer obeyed her as it once had. Her knees ached, her eyesight dimmed, her movements slowed, but within her mind there remained a clear flame, steady and analytical. She began to see her long life, not as punishment, but as responsibility. "The Lord has preserved me," she wrote, "for some purpose. I must not waste what remains." Her public re-emergence began cautiously. At first, she allowed herself to be seen at local events in Scotland and on the Isle of Wight, small gatherings, military parades, dedications. The people received her with astonishment and relief. Wherever she appeared, crowds pressed close, eager for even a glimpse. They had forgiven her long silence. Indeed, they seemed to understand it. Her grief had made her human in their eyes. When she rode past in her open carriage, frail and veiled, they did not see aloofness, but endurance. She had suffered as they had suffered, and she had endured. That recognition, quiet, collective, reverent, was the true beginning of her reawakening. By the time of her Golden Jubilee, in 1887, Victoria had been on the throne for 50 years, half a century of rule, half a century of transformation. The celebrations were immense, and for the first time since her widowhood, she allowed the full splendour of the monarchy to return. The streets of London erupted with colour flags, garlands, and arches of flowers. Soldiers from every colony marched through the city in brilliant uniforms. Canadians in scarlet coats, Sikhs in turbans, Australians in wide-brimmed hats. It was the living embodiment of empire, and at its centre sat the small figure of the Queen, dressed in black silk, her diamond-studded crown glinting faintly under the summer sun. As she passed, the crowds roared. The cheers rolled through the city like a tide, echoing from one district to another. Old men wept. Women waved handkerchiefs. Children scrambled onto rooftops to glimpse her. The sound seemed to envelop her carriage in a living embrace. "It was wonderful, beautiful beyond words," she wrote that night. "The love of my people is the greatest comfort I could ever know." For a moment, she felt herself not merely ruler of Britain, but of time itself, past, present, and future, united in the rhythm of her long reign. But even in that moment of glory, she remained inwardly humble. The Jubilee was not her triumph alone, she insisted, but Albert's. She ordered that his memory be honoured at every ceremony, his favourite hymns sung, his name invoked in prayers. "He is with me still," she told her daughter Beatrice, "and all this splendour is his doing." Her newfound vitality carried her through the next decade. Though she aged visibly, she became more politically astute than ever. Prime ministers came and went, Gladstone, Salisbury, Disraeli, and she handled them all with a confidence born of experience. With Gladstone she sparred constantly, finding his moralising sermons tiresome. "He speaks to me," she said once, "as if I were a public meeting." With Disraeli she shared affection and admiration. His gallant flattery pleased her vanity. His vision of empire matched her pride. "He is a man of genius," she declared. "He makes me believe again in greatness." Her later letters reveal a shrewd, pragmatic mind. She had seen too much of the world to believe in simplicity. She worried over Ireland, lamented the unrest in India, fretted about her grandchildren's politics in Germany and Russia. She corresponded with ministers in every colony, reading dispatches into the early hours. Though her body was failing, her intellect remained razor-sharp. She could quote policy details from memory, recall the nuances of foreign treaties, and detect evasions in a minister's report. Her secretaries called her the most diligent sovereign alive. Yet the real transformation of her later life lay not in politics, but in her renewed sense of connection to ordinary people. She had come to see that her image, once remote and frozen, could serve as a kind of comfort to her subjects. She began to appear in public more frequently, attending ceremonies, visiting hospitals, even venturing to industrial towns. When she visited Manchester in 1897, the workers lined the streets, their faces blackened from the mills, their caps in their hands. She smiled at them gently, tears in her eyes. "They have worked so hard," she whispered. "They deserve to be seen." The monarchy, which had nearly withered in her years of seclusion, now flourished again. Her public appearances were carefully staged, brief, dignified, and always symbolic, but they restored the emotional bond between crown and people. She became less a ruler and more a grandmother to the nation, kind, steady, enduring. Her longevity itself was a miracle to her subjects, a reassurance that amid the chaos of industrial change, something eternal still stood. Her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 was the pinnacle of this reawakening. The procession wound through London for miles, a river of colour and sound. Representatives from every colony marched in unison, their flags fluttering in the breeze. Ships in the Thames fired salutes, choirs sang hymns, and the streets overflowed with millions of citizens. For once, even the sky cooperated, a pale blue arch of peace above the Empire's proud heart. Victoria watched from her carriage, too frail now to stand, her hand trembling as she waved. The cheers were deafening. "It was like the voice of God," she said later. "It filled my soul with gratitude." That night, she wrote in her diary, 60 years of reign, and such love as I have seen today is beyond all earthly reward. I thank God that He has preserved me to see it." In these years of her resurgence, she found a new sense of peace with her children as well. The long rift with Bertie, the Prince of Wales, began to heal. She had never forgiven him for the recklessness of his youth, but as she aged, forgiveness came more easily. She recognized his charm, his competence in public affairs, his popularity. "He has improved," she admitted reluctantly, "and he will make a good king." They grew closer, their correspondence softening in tone, the wounds of decades finally fading. Her household changed too. After John Brown's death, another loyal servant entered her life, Abdul Karim, the Indian Munshi. To the scandal of her court, she treated him with kindness and equality, teaching him English manners even as he taught her Hindustani phrases. She found in him the same honesty and warmth she had once cherished in Brown. Ministers fumed, courtiers gossiped, but she ignored them all. "They do not understand the comfort of friendship," she wrote. "The world is cold without it." Through Karim, she maintained her fascination with India, continuing to study its history and traditions. Her affection for her distant subjects, though idealized, was sincere. "They are all my children," she said, "black and white, rich and poor, all under one God." The last decade of her life was marked by tranquility tinged with fatigue. She continued to travel between Windsor, Osborne, and Balmoral, each place a chapter of her existence. Windsor was the house of memory, Osborne, the house of work, Balmoral, the house of peace. She spent her days writing letters, reading novels, dictating memoirs, and taking carriage drives through the countryside. Her evenings were quiet, small dinners with family, readings from Tennyson or Browning, prayers whispered by candlelight. In those twilight years, the storms of the wider world still reached her ears. She followed the wars in Africa, the stirrings of nationalism in Ireland, the growth of labour unions and socialism, but she viewed these through the lens of age and experience. Everything, to her, seemed cyclical, nothing truly new under the sun. "All things pass," she wrote near the end of her reign, "only duty remains." And indeed, duty was the thread that had guided her from beginning to end. It had carried her through the loneliness of childhood, the intoxication of youth, the agony of widowhood, and the burden of empire. Now, in her final years, duty had transformed into something gentler, a sense of gratitude. "God has been very good to me," she told her chaplain. "He has given me much to bear, but also the strength to bear it." By the dawn of the 20th century, Queen Victoria was no longer merely a monarch, but a living relic of history. She had outlived the age of steam and entered the age of electricity, had ruled over subjects born in the Georgian era and those who would live into the modern one. The people no longer saw her as a sovereign, distant and divine, but as a figure almost maternal, a symbol of endurance itself. She had become, in her old age, what she had always longed to be, both beloved and at peace. When she sat at her desk in the last winter of her life, her hand trembled as she wrote, but her heart was calm. "I have seen so much," she wrote, "sorrow, joy, progress, and decay. But still, I trust that the world grows better, for I have seen goodness in my people's hearts." And thus the Queen, who had once ruled through love of a husband and later through the discipline of duty, learned, at last, to rule through compassion. The reawakening of Victoria was not a triumph of glory, but of grace, the slow, luminous acceptance that life, with all its burdens, was still worth loving. Family webs across Europe. By the final decades of Queen Victoria's reign, the empire over which she ruled was not only vast in geography, but sprawling in blood. Her children and grandchildren had married into nearly every royal house on the continent, their unions woven like golden threads through the map of Europe. What began as maternal affection became the architecture of diplomacy, and the domestic heart of Victoria's family transformed into a web of alliances, ambitions, and rivalries that would shape the future of nations. She had once been a young mother surrounded by nursery laughter at Osborne and Windsor, 9 children clinging to her skirts and climbing over Albert's desk while he tried to read dispatches. But time, relentless and indifferent, had scattered those children across the world. Each had carried something of her, a gesture, a phrase, a habit of mind, but each also bore a destiny far beyond her control. As she aged, her family became her empire within the empire, a constellation of princes and princesses orbiting the small, stooped figure of their matriarch. Her eldest, Victoria, the Princess Royal known to the family as Vicky, was perhaps the closest in spirit to Albert. Brilliant, cultured, and opinionated, she had inherited her father's intellect and her mother's force of will. In 1858, she had married Prince Frederick of Prussia, heir to the future German Empire. It had been a love match at first, but also a political one. Albert and Victoria dreamed that this union would bring liberal ideals into the heart of continental Europe. Vicky's letters home were filled with descriptions of Berlin's cold grandeur, of rigid court etiquette, of her struggles against the militarism and conservatism that dominated Prussian life. "Dearest Mama," she wrote, "they have no idea what constitutional government means here. They think kings are gods, not servants of their people." Victoria sympathised deeply, though she also cautioned her daughter not to defy her adopted nation too openly. "You must show patience," she replied. "One cannot reform the world in a day." The exchange between mother and daughter would continue for decades, 2 queens in spirit, divided by distance, united by conviction. When Vicky's son, Wilhelm, was born in 1859, the Queen rejoiced. She called him "my darling little William," unaware that this infant, with his strong eyes and withered arm, would one day become the Kaiser who led Germany into war against her beloved England. As a child, Wilhelm adored his grandmother, though their relationship grew strained as he matured. He admired her authority but resented her power. She saw in him both promise and danger. "He has great energy," she noted, "but he is too impetuous. I fear he will not listen to wise counsel." Her second child, Bertie the Prince of Wales, was a different challenge entirely. Handsome, charming, and gregarious, he lacked his father's seriousness, but possessed an instinctive ease with people that his mother could never quite match. After Albert's death, her grief had curdled into resentment toward him, as though his youthful indiscretions had hastened the tragedy. For years, She treated him coolly, keeping him at arm's length from affairs of state. But as he grew older, his natural diplomacy began to mend the breach. His marriage to Princess Alexandra of Denmark in 1863 had brought warmth to the royal household. Alexandra's beauty, grace, and kindness won the hearts of the British public instantly. Victoria, at first wary of her daughter-in-law, came to admire her devotion and gentleness. "Dear Alex," she wrote, "is so patient and good. She has softened much that was hard in Bertie." Their union, though not without its private strains, produced 6 children who would carry the royal line into the 20th century. As the years passed, Bertie became a vital link between the crown and the people. He attended public functions, travelled across Europe, and represented Britain abroad with charm and tact. The Queen, still cautious, allowed him greater visibility but not real authority. "He will succeed me one day," she said, "but that day must not come too soon." It said her third child, Alice, shared her mother's tenderness and melancholy. Married to Prince Louis of Hesse, she became known for her compassion and charity. She worked tirelessly among the poor, nursed the sick during outbreaks of disease, and wrote to Victoria with humility and love. "You have your father's heart," the Queen told her, proud yet anxious. In 1878, tragedy struck. Alice's young son, little Fritty, died after falling from a window. Grief engulfed her, but she continued to serve her people selflessly until diphtheria swept through her household that winter. She nursed her children without rest, contracted the illness herself, and died on December 14th, the anniversary of Albert's death. When the news reached Windsor, Victoria wept uncontrollably. "The same day, the same blow," she wrote. "It is too cruel." The Queen's 4th son, Alfred, Affy, took a naval career and later became Duke of Edinburgh and, through marriage to the Grand Duchess Marie of Russia, a member of the Romanov dynasty, his union with the Tsar's daughter linked the British crown to the Russian throne, a bond that glittered with ceremony but was brittle beneath the surface. Alfred's wife, proud and imperious, found British life dull and provincial. "They think me cold," she complained, "but I am only lonely." Victoria, who valued modesty above grandeur, clashed with her often. "She has too much pride for her own good," she wrote. Yet, even amid the friction, the Queen saw the political advantage of the alliance. "It is well," she told Disraeli, "that England and Russia should be bound by family ties. Perhaps they will restrain the ambitions of men." Her other children formed similar connections across the continent. Helena married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, a union of duty more than romance, but a happy one nonetheless. Louise, the artistic and independent one, shocked society by marrying a commoner, John Campbell, the Duke of Argyll's son. "A daughter of England," the Queen declared, "may set an example that rank is not all." Leopold, the youngest son, inherited his father's intellect and his haemophilia, the genetic curse that would haunt the royal line. He died young, leaving behind a widow and 2 small children. "My poor boy," Victoria mourned, "his mind so fine, his body so frail." Her youngest child, Beatrice, became her constant companion and solace. Gentle, patient, and obedient, she remained unmarried until her mother allowed it, and even then, only on condition that she live near the Queen. When she married Prince Henry of Battenberg, Victoria's heart nearly broke again when he died of fever in Africa in 1896. "It is endless," she wrote. "The partings never cease." Through all these unions, the Queen became not just the matriarch of Britain but the grandmother of Europe. Her descendants sat upon the thrones of Germany, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Greece, Romania, and Spain. Diplomats joked that a single family dinner at Windsor could decide the fate of continents. The press dubbed her Europe's grandmother, and she accepted the title with both pride and trepidation. "It is a strange thing," she mused, "to be the mother of so many nations and yet master of none. Okay. Her letters to her grandchildren were endless, affectionate, admonishing, meticulous. She dispensed advice on everything from etiquette to governance, from child-rearing to faith. "Remember," she told the young Wilhelm, "that a ruler's greatest duty is self-control. You must not allow pride to rule your heart." He adored her, though her authority irked him. When he became Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1888, their relationship cooled. He saw himself as the embodiment of the new century, bold and militaristic, while she remained the embodiment of the old, measured, moral, and cautious. "Grandmama," he told an aide once, "belongs to another world." Victoria's grandchildren filled her life with both joy and anxiety. Each represented a fragment of her own vast legacy, and she tried desperately to hold them together. She corresponded with the Tsarina Alexandra, her granddaughter and wife of Nicholas II of Russia, offering comfort and counsel. "You must pray always," she told her. "Faith will sustain you through the storms." But she also saw the shadows gathering around the Romanovs, the isolation of the Tsar, the unrest of the Russian people, the curse of haemophilia in their son. "I fear," she wrote in one of her final letters, "that they live upon a volcano." The same could be said of all Europe. The web of royal kinship that she had woven, meant to preserve peace, had become a labyrinth of jealousy and rivalry. The great powers watched one another with suspicion. Germany's ambition grew, Russia's instability deepened, France's resentment simmered, and Britain, proud yet weary, stood at the centre of it all, bound to each by ties of blood and history. Victoria's dream of a harmonious family of nations was beginning to fray. "They are all too headstrong," she lamented. "Each one wishes to be right, and none will listen." And yet, she continued to believe in the power of kinship to soften politics. Her Christmas gatherings were legendary crowds of princes, princesses, and grandchildren filling the halls of Windsor or Osborne. She presided over them like a small, ancient sun at the centre of an orbiting world. The noise of children's laughter echoed through the rooms that had once been silent with mourning. Her lap overflowed with little hands. Her cane became a toy for mischievous toddlers. She watched them play with wistful joy. "I see Albert in them all," she said. "He lives on in their faces." As the century neared its end, Victoria's family network stretched farther than her empire. It was both her pride and her curse. The very bonds she had forged in the name of peace would one day pull Europe into war. But she could not foresee that. To her, the marriages of her children were acts of love and diplomacy intertwined, each one a thread in the great design of Providence. She had begun her reign as a daughter, ruled as a wife, endured as a widow, and now, in her twilight, she reigned as a mother of nations. The blood of her line flowed through empires. Her name echoed in every court. And though she had lost so much husband, children, friends, she found solace in the thought that her legacy would live on in the hearts, faces, and destinies of those who bore her name. The Victorian Age unfolds. The years that stretched through the second half of Queen Victoria's reign became something larger than a monarchy, larger even than an empire. They became an era. No other reign in British history would so completely imprint itself upon the national character that it lent its sovereign's name to the age itself. The Victorian Age was not merely a chronological period. It was an atmosphere, a faith, a moral compass, and a mirror held up to the contradictions of modern civilization. Under Victoria's long shadow, the world was being remade. Steam and steel, faith and doubt, empire and conscience all clashed and coalesced into a century's defining mood. When Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, Britain had been a country poised between centuries, half medieval, half modern. When she reached her twilight in the 1,890 seconds, it had become the workshop of the world, the nerve centre of a global network of trade, technology, and culture. The transformation was not merely political or industrial, but psychological. A sense of purpose, restraint, and moral certitude permeated every layer of society, and at its centre stood the small, solemn figure of the Queen. Her values, duty, thrift, family, piety were absorbed by the nation and reflected back to her as the creed of an age. To the millions who never saw her, she was the embodiment of stability in a world that changed by the hour. She sat upon the throne like an anchor sunk deep into the moral seabed of the empire. Through wars, revolutions, and discoveries, her steady presence gave shape to progress. Her image, widowed, veiled, and serene, became synonymous with endurance. She was not merely monarch, she was moral metaphor. Yet beneath this facade of certainty, the Victorian world pulsed with contradiction. It was an era of boundless faith in progress, but also of crippling poverty, of church-going respectability and hidden vice, of imperial confidence and private doubt. The great cities of Britain, London, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, grew swollen with workers drawn from the countryside. The skyline rose with chimneys, the air thickened with soot, and the sound of the factory bell replaced the rhythm of the church bell. The Industrial Revolution had promised prosperity, but it also birthed an underclass that lived and died in shadow. Victoria was shielded from the worst of this reality, yet not unaware of it. Reports of child labour, disease, and destitution crossed her desk often. Her compassion was sincere, if limited by her belief in divine order. "The poor," she once wrote, "suffer grievously, yet they are patient and good. We must do our best to relieve them, but their trials are part of God's great plan." Her faith in providence lent moral gravity to her reign, but also blinded her to the deeper systemic injustices of industrial life. Still, her influence helped foster an age of reform. The Queen's personal virtues, self-discipline, sobriety, diligence, filtered down into politics and culture. The reform bills that expanded the franchise, the factory acts that limited child labour, and the creation of public education all found moral support in the ethos of her reign. The idea that the monarchy could stand as a moral example rather than a political weapon was perhaps Victoria's greatest contribution to British life. Her court became the model of domestic virtue. Where previous monarchs had surrounded themselves with intrigue and scandal, Victoria's household radiated family order. Paintings and engravings of the Queen surrounded by her children, her hand resting on Albert's shoulder, became ubiquitous. The image of the royal family at prayer, or gathered around the Christmas tree, a German custom Albert had popularised, reinforced the notion of monarchy as an idealised household writ large, a national family presided over by its motherly queen. This domestic ideal seeped into the wider culture. Middle-class families emulated the decorum of the royal household. Respectability became the cardinal virtue of the age. Men were expected to be industrious and restrained, women pious and nurturing. The angel in the house, as poets called her, was the moral guardian of domestic life. But beneath the lace and civility, repression simmered. The same society that preached chastity turned a blind eye to prostitution. The same age that prized gentility tolerated the brutalities of empire. The Victorian conscience, for all its pride, was haunted by its own hypocrisy. The more the empire expanded, the more its citizens were forced to reconcile Christian morality with the machinery of conquest. Missionaries preached salvation even as soldiers conquered. Victoria herself saw no contradiction. To her, empire was a moral duty, a benevolent guardianship over less advanced peoples. "We have been chosen by Providence," she once wrote, "to carry civilization and faith to those in darkness." That belief, shared by her ministers and subjects, became the moral foundation of imperialism. The Queen's personal piety remained unshaken throughout her life. She began every morning with scripture and ended every night with prayer. She believed deeply in divine order and saw her own reign as part of God's plan. "I am but his instrument," she told her chaplain, "set upon this throne for his purposes, not my own." Her faith lent her courage through countless sorrows, yet it also gave her certainty that her vision of morality was universal. The Victorian Age's confidence in righteousness flowed directly from the Queen's own convictions. But if her faith anchored her, science and doubt were eroding the world around her. In 1859, Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species shook Victorian belief to its core. The theory of evolution by natural selection challenged the very idea of divine creation. The intellectual circles of London buzzed with debate. Pulpits thundered in condemnation. The Queen herself, though curious, was cautious. She read a summary of Darwin's work prepared by her scientific advisors and found it strange but interesting. Her instinct was to reconcile, not reject. "All truth," she said, "is God's truth, though we may not yet understand his ways." This attempt to harmonize faith and science became a hallmark of the era. The Victorians, unlike their revolutionary ancestors, sought not to overthrow the old order but to adapt it. They built museums to display the wonders of nature, libraries to preserve knowledge, and schools to educate a generation that believed progress and piety could coexist. The Great Exhibition of 1851, Albert's crowning achievement, had already embodied that faith in human ingenuity. Now, even after his death, its spirit lingered the conviction that reason and morality together could perfect the world. The cultural flowering of the age was extraordinary. Writers like Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy explored the moral and social fabric of industrial Britain. Poets such as Tennyson and Browning gave voice to its aspirations and doubts. Painters of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood revived colour and symbolism. Architects rebuilt cities in Gothic splendour. In music, art, and philosophy, the Victorian world sought beauty not as escape, but as redemption, a means to reconcile human suffering with divine order. Victoria, though not an artist herself, was deeply affected by this blossoming. She loved music and painting, often sketching watercolours in her private hours. She admired the poetry of Tennyson, whose elegy, In Memoriam, she read repeatedly after Albert's death. "He understands grief," she said, "and gives it voice without despair." The arts became, for her, a mirror of moral sentiment refined, earnest, purposeful. She disliked frivolity in art as she did in life. "Art," she once said, "should uplift, not corrupt." The same tension that defined her reign between moral restraint and worldly expansion also defined its social order. Beneath the polite veneer of Victorian society lay sharp divisions. Class defined everything: accent, dress, education, even morality. The upper and middle classes cloaked themselves in respectability, while the poor lived in crowded tenements and toiled in factories. Reformers like Florence Nightingale, Charles Booth, and Octavia Hill began to expose the grim underside of prosperity. The Queen followed their work with interest, praising their courage. "God bless the good women who bring light to the dark places," she wrote after reading of Nightingale's hospital reforms. Women, once confined to the domestic sphere, were beginning to find voices of their own. Writers such as the Bronte sisters, Elizabeth Gaskell, and George Eliot explored the inner lives of women with unprecedented honesty. Suffragists like Millicent Fawcett and Josephine Butler began to demand not only compassion but justice. Victoria, paradoxically, opposed women's suffrage. She viewed it as contrary to woman's divinely appointed role. The mad, wicked folly of women's rights, she called it. Yet she ruled an empire of men with iron authority, a living contradiction that history would not fail to note. Even as society shifted, technology continued its relentless advance. The telegraph shrank the world, the steamship conquered the seas, and the railway bound the empire together. When the first transatlantic cable was completed in 1866, allowing messages to travel between Britain and America in minutes rather than weeks. Victoria sent a telegram to President Buchanan. "Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill toward men." It was the voice of the old world greeting the new faith embracing progress. London, her capital, became the very image of modernity. Its skyline was a forest of spires and chimneys, its streets a river of carriages, cabs, and omnibuses. The Thames, once foul with waste, was transformed by monumental engineering works into a symbol of civic pride. The city's vast exhibitions, museums, and theatres drew visitors from every corner of the world. Yet even amid grandeur, Victoria never forgot her personal sense of modesty. She disliked ostentation, preferred plain furnishings, and wore simple black attire to the end of her days. "Simplicity," she said, "is the truest nobility." As the 19th century neared its end, the contradictions of her age deepened. The same empire that had spread commerce and Christianity also sowed unrest and rebellion. Colonized peoples began to question Britain's moral right to rule. Irish nationalists demanded self-government, Indian intellectuals spoke of freedom, workers organized for better conditions. The moral empire was showing its cracks. Victoria, nearing her 80s, observed these changes with a mixture of anxiety and faith. "The world grows noisy," she wrote, "but I trust that goodness will prevail." To her subjects, she had become a symbol of permanence amid chaos. The very length of her reign gave it mythic quality. Children grew old and died having known no other sovereign. Her face on coins and stamps, her signature on laws and proclamations, her presence at jubilees and ceremonies, these became the fixed points by which a restless world oriented itself. By 1900, when she celebrated her 63rd year on the throne, the phrase Victorian Age had already entered common speech. It stood for order, decency, faith, and progress, but also for restraint, repression, and contradiction. It was an age of grandeur built upon labour, of morality shadowed by empire, of light cast against deepening twilight. Victoria herself, though too humble to call the age her own, recognised its magnitude. "It is strange," she wrote near the end, "to have one's life bound up with so much change. I began in the time of candles, and I shall die in the age of electricity. Yet still the heart of man is the same." The Victorian age had unfolded like a great tapestry, its threads of virtue and vice woven together into patterns of astonishing beauty and terrible complexity. And through it all, at the centre, sat the woman whose name it bore, unchanging, watchful, steadfast. She had reigned not only over a nation but over a century's imagination, and though her own life would soon draw to its quiet close, the world she had shaped would carry her spirit long into the future, the Queen and her people. By the time Queen Victoria entered the final decade of her reign, she had become something far greater than a monarch. She was, in the eyes of her people, the embodiment of the nation's endurance, the living pulse of an empire that spanned the earth. She had weathered grief and revolution, presided over industrial triumph and colonial expansion, and reigned for so long that her very existence had come to seem inseparable from the stability of Britain itself. Her face, once youthful and curious, now softened by age and memory, was imprinted upon coins, postage stamps, medals, and the imagination of her subjects. For nearly 60 years, she had been the one unbroken thread through a century of relentless change. To her people, she was the Queen, not as a title but as an essence, an article of faith. The child born in 1819, who had ascended the throne barely 18 years old, had grown into an institution unto herself, an emblem of constancy amid the rush of progress. Yet for all her distance and majesty, Victoria remained, at her core, a profoundly human figure, and as her reign matured into its last decade, she began slowly, cautiously, to draw nearer to her people once more. In her youth, Victoria had been seen by the public at every turn. Her coronation, her marriage, Her appearances at the balcony of Buckingham Palace all had captured the imagination of a nation that saw in her the promise of renewal. But after Albert's death, her long withdrawal had frozen that connection. For nearly 2 decades, her subjects had known her only through printed words and occasional glimpses of her black-veiled figure at state ceremonies. It had taken time, and the careful encouragement of ministers like Benjamin Disraeli, to restore her public presence. By the 1,880 and 1,890, however, the Queen's isolation had given way to a quiet intimacy with her people that transcended politics or pomp. Everywhere she went, from the industrial cities of the north to the rural villages of Scotland, crowds gathered not to cheer a distant ruler, but to greet a familiar grandmother. Children were lifted onto shoulders to wave Union Jacks. Factory workers stood bareheaded in the rain as her carriage passed. When she visited hospitals, miners' cottages, or military camps, there was no pretense of ceremony, only affection. Her frailty endeared her to them. She was old, small, and shuffling, but her eyes still shone with an unmistakable light. "She looks like my own mother," one woman whispered as the royal carriage rolled by, and thousands felt the same. Victoria, who had once feared the scrutiny of the public, came to take solace in their love. "Their affection comforts me," she wrote in her journal. "It feels like the warmth of family." She had always believed in monarchy as a moral bond rather than a mere system of rule. But in her final years, she began to understand it as a kind of shared memory, a collective faith that connected sovereign and subject in mutual endurance. "They have suffered and laboured as I have suffered and laboured," she told her daughter Beatrice. "We have grown old together, my people and I." That mutual affection became most visible during the grand jubilees that marked her reign's milestones. The Golden Jubilee of 1,887 had celebrated 50 years upon the throne. The Diamond Jubilee of 1,897, 60 years, transformed London into the beating heart of the world. The procession stretched for miles through streets draped in flags and flowers, past cheering crowds that seemed to flow endlessly toward the horizon. Soldiers from every corner of the empire marched in her honour, Zulus in plumed helmets, Sikhs in golden turbans, Maoris in feathered cloaks, Canadians and Australians in scarlet and khaki. Never before had the empire appeared so vast, so united. As her carriage rolled slowly through the jubilant city, the Queen sat upright despite her frailty, her black dress gleaming faintly in the sunlight, her small diamond crown resting upon her white hair. Her face, though lined with age, radiated calm. The cheers of her people rose and fell like waves. "It was beyond description," she wrote that night. "Such love, such loyalty. I can never be thankful enough." The Jubilee celebrations had not been merely pageantry. They were an act of collective devotion. To her subjects, Victoria symbolized the moral triumph of perseverance, the proof that time itself could be mastered by patience, faith, and duty. Even those who had once criticized her seclusion now revered her for her steadfastness. The widowed queen in perpetual mourning had become a national icon of virtue, her private sorrow transformed into the moral backbone of a nation. Beyond Britain's shores, her image carried even greater weight. Across the empire, her likeness adorned coins, stamps, and portraits that hung in government buildings, schools, and railway stations. In India, she was revered almost mystically, her name spoken with both awe and familiarity. In Canada and Australia, colonists toasted the Mother Queen, who had presided over their progress from outposts to nations. Even in distant Africa, chiefs and governors invoked her name as symbol of peace and justice. "God save the Queen," they said, not as habit but as invocation. And yet, for all her glory, Victoria never forgot the human cost of empire. Reports of wars and famines reached her daily. The Mahdist uprising in Sudan, the Zulu War, the Afghan campaigns. She read of British soldiers dying in deserts and mountains thousands of miles away and felt a personal responsibility for each loss. "It breaks my heart," she wrote during the Second Boer War, "that so many of my brave ones perish far from home." She sent letters to the widows and mothers of soldiers, wrote notes of condolence in her own hand, and dispatched parcels of food, blankets, and comfort items to the front. "I am their mother," she said simply. "Their pain is mine." The public saw these gestures not as politics but as genuine compassion. When wounded soldiers returned from the wars, she received them personally, shaking each man's hand and thanking him for his courage. "You have done your duty," she would say softly. "Your queen is proud of you." These words, simple and sincere, carried enormous power. Men who had faced death in battle wept openly in her presence. The soldiers called her the Mother of the Army, and the name spread throughout the empire. Her empathy extended beyond class and race, even if filtered through the paternalism of her age. When she heard of the suffering caused by famines in India, she ordered relief funds and pressed her ministers to act more quickly. When missionaries reported cruelty in the colonies, she expressed outrage and demanded reform. She corresponded with abolitionists and social reformers, lending moral weight to causes she believed in. "We must never forget," she wrote, "that all men are God's children, and our power over them is a sacred trust." Yet she remained deeply conservative at heart. She mistrusted the new politics of socialism and feminism, fearing they would disrupt the harmony of society. "They speak of equality," she said, "but forget that order is heaven's first law." Still, she recognized the need for compassion and reform. When the Factory Acts and housing reforms were passed, she supported them wholeheartedly. "Progress," she wrote, "is good when it is guided by conscience." Her reign, by then the longest in British history, had become the mirror by which her people measured their own lives. She had ruled through 7 decades, across wars, inventions, and revolutions, and in her endurance they saw the continuity of their world. "While she lives," wrote one newspaper, "Britain is eternal." That belief gave the monarchy a sacred aura it had not possessed since medieval times. In her later years, Victoria's correspondence revealed a mellowing of spirit. The fierce pride that had once made her intolerant softened into understanding. She wrote affectionately to her ministers, thanked servants for their loyalty, and filled her journals with reflections on faith and mortality. "Life," she wrote near her 80th birthday, "has been full of trial, yet God has sustained me. If I have done good, it is through His strength alone." Her health, however, began to fail. Age crept upon her slowly, but inexorably. Her eyesight dimmed, her hearing faltered, and her legs pained her when she walked. Still, she insisted on fulfilling her duties. Even in her 80s, she rose early to read state papers, met her ministers, and signed official documents with a steady hand. "Work," she said, "is the best balm for sorrow." The affection between queen and people only deepened as her strength waned. When she appeared in public, her frailty drew tears rather than pity. Crowds cheered not for her power, but for her perseverance. In her old age, she had become the heart of her people's conscience, the living memory of a century that had reshaped the world. When the Boer War broke out in 1899, she was 80 years old, yet she followed the conflict with intense concern. Reports of battles at Ladysmith and Mafeking reached her daily. She wrote personally to commanders and sent small gifts to the troops' chocolate boxes embossed with her image, each bearing the inscription, "I wish you a happy new year," and Godspeed. Soldiers carried them in their packs as talismans, treasures from the grandmother they called Mother of the Empire. It was during this time that the world began to whisper of her nearing end. The newspapers wrote of her with reverence bordering on prayer. "When she goes," one editor wrote, "the age itself will end." Yet the Queen faced her decline with calm acceptance. "I have lived long," she told her physician. "I have done my duty. I am not afraid." By 1900, The Victorian Age had become a myth even before it ended. The Queen's name was synonymous with progress and moral order, yet also with the contradictions of empire. Her people loved her, not because she was perfect, but because she was steadfast, because she had walked through grief, labour, and change without surrendering to despair. She had grown old with them, and in her endurance they recognized their own. When she last addressed her nation, her words were simple. Let us all thank God for his great mercy, and let us trust in him for the future. I have always believed that love is stronger than death, and that duty is the noblest word in any language. The Queen, who had once been a girl in a white gown, trembling beneath the weight of her crown, was now an old woman wrapped in black, her crown diminished but her soul magnified. The bond between her and her people was no longer that of ruler and subject, but of mother and family. The empire she had nurtured might one day fade, but the love between Victoria and her people would remain a light that would outlast even the longest reign. The final winter, the dawn of the 20th century, arrived, with the hush of a turning page. Snow fell softly over Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, blanketing the gardens where Queen Victoria's grandchildren once played. The grand house that Albert had designed, his labour of love by the sea, was quiet now, its corridors filled with the scent of aging wood and lavender polish. Inside, the old Queen sat near the window in her wheeled chair, wrapped in black shawls, her small form framed by the grey light of winter. The woman who had outlasted an age watched the new century creep in with both awe and weariness. "The world has changed so greatly," she murmured to her lady-in-waiting, "and I am so very tired." For 81 years, she had borne the weight of duty without faltering. She had seen Britain transformed from a modest island kingdom into the mightiest empire in history. She had watched the flicker of oil lamps give way to electric light, the gallop of horses replaced by the hum of motor cars, the written letter supplanted by the telegraph. Through it all, she had remained an immovable centre around which the modern world revolved. But now, as the century turned, even she felt the tide of time drawing away. Her health had been declining steadily since the Diamond Jubilee of 1897. The endless public ceremonies, the travel, and the emotional strain of the Boer War had taken their toll. She suffered from rheumatism that made walking painful, cataracts that dimmed her vision, and a weariness that no physician could cure. Yet she still insisted on daily audiences with ministers, reading dispatches through a magnifying glass and dictating letters to her private secretaries. "If I rest," she said, "I shall rust." But even as she clung to her work, her body began to betray her. By the end of 1900, she could no longer climb the stairs without help. Servants carried her carefully in a special chair from her bedroom to the drawing room, where she would sit for hours surrounded by papers, family photographs, and mementos of her youth. Her favourite spot was near the window, overlooking the Solent, where she could watch ships passing toward Portsmouth. "I love the sight of the sea," she told her daughter Beatrice. "It reminds me of eternity." Her thoughts in those final months often turned backward rather than forward. She spoke frequently of Albert, as she had every day since his death nearly 40 years earlier. "He comes to me in dreams," she whispered. "Always young, always kind. Soon we shall be together again." On her writing desk still stood his portrait in a golden frame, worn smooth by her touch. She wrote to him nightly in her journal, her handwriting shaky but deliberate. "My beloved angel, I long for the day when we shall never again be parted." The Queen's private moments were filled with ghosts. She would sometimes call out for Vicky or Affy, forgetting they were gone. Her attendants learned to answer gently, never reminding her too harshly of loss. She would ask for music, the hymns Albert had loved, the Scottish airs Brown had once hummed while escorting her through Balmoral's hills. When the organist played Rock of Ages, her lips moved silently in prayer. Despite her fragility, she remained sharp of mind. Ministers who came expecting to find her diminished left astonished at her clarity. She remembered details of policies, the names of soldiers, even the figures of foreign debts. She received Lord Salisbury, her Prime Minister, only weeks before her death and spoke lucidly of the Empire's condition. "The times grow unsettled," she told him. "There is too much pride among nations. Tell Bertie that peace must be his first duty." She worried constantly about the world she would leave behind. The Boer War weighed heavily upon her conscience. Reports of suffering in South Africa reached Osborne daily, and though she approved of the cause, she grieved for the loss of life. "I cannot bear," she wrote, "that men should die for glory. They should die only for duty." She sent prayers to the front, blessings to every regiment, and tokens of comfort to the wounded. Her faith in the righteousness of empire never wavered, but her heart grew heavy with compassion. Her family gathered close as her strength waned. Beatrice, ever her companion, watched over her constantly. Bertie, the Prince of Wales, visited frequently, kneeling beside her chair and taking her frail hand in his. Their long history of misunderstanding had softened into affection. "You have become a good man, Bertie," she told him one evening. "Your father would be proud." He wept quietly at her words. Grandchildren arrived from across Europe, the Kaiser Wilhelm from Germany, princes and princesses from Denmark, Greece, and Russia. The house that had once echoed with the laughter of children now murmured with the quiet grief of generations. They spoke softly in the corridors, unwilling to disturb her rest, yet each sought a private audience with her. "She blessed us all," one wrote later, and spoke as though she were already half in heaven. On the 18th of January 1901, her doctor, Sir James Reed, noted a sudden decline. The Queen had slept poorly, her pulse weak, her appetite gone. "I feel so strange," she whispered, "like a cloud is closing around me." Over the next few days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she rallied briefly, asking about the war or the weather, or murmuring prayers. At other times she seemed to gaze past the room entirely, her eyes fixed on some unseen horizon. The final evening was serene. A soft rain fell outside Osborne's windows, and the sea lay calm under a silver moon. The Queen lay propped against her pillows, dressed in a white nightgown trimmed with lace. Around her bed gathered her children and grandchildren, her ministers and attendants who had served her for decades. Candles flickered in the still air, the clock ticked gently. "Do not grieve too much for me," she said faintly. "I have had enough of life's trials, and I am ready." Beatrice knelt beside her, holding one hand. Bertie clasped the other. The Queen's lips moved in prayer, words of gratitude, of faith, of reunion. "God bless my dear country," she murmured, "and bless my children." Then, with a faint smile, she whispered, "I am coming, my beloved." Her breathing slowed, grew shallow, and at 6:30 in the evening, on the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria passed peacefully into the stillness she had awaited for so long. The moment her heart stopped, the era ended. The doctors bowed their heads. Her children wept in silence. Outside, the flag at Osborne was lowered to half-mast, and word began to spread across the empire. Within hours, telegraphs carried the news from London to India, Canada, Australia, and Africa. The Queen is dead. Across 5 continents, church bells tolled in mourning. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor, their faces pale with disbelief. Many had known no other monarch in their lifetime. It felt as though the very heartbeat of the world had paused. For the people, she was not only their queen but their past, the living thread that connected them to their parents and grandparents, to a time when the world was slower, steadier, more certain. They mourned her as family. Newspapers wept ink in columns of tribute. She was our mother and our conscience. Even Republicans bowed their heads, acknowledging her virtue and endurance. The task of arranging her funeral began immediately, following the detailed instructions she had left behind. True to her nature, She had planned every aspect with care years before. She had forbidden excessive gloom, commanding that her coffin be draped not in black but in white, no dark pall. She had written, "I go to rejoin the light." She wished to be buried beside Albert at Frogmore, dressed in her wedding veil, with mementos of her loved ones placed around her locks of hair, photographs, and letters. In her right hand she asked that Albert's dressing gown be folded, in her left a plaster cast of his hand. She also requested a small photo of John Brown, her faithful servant, to be hidden in her coffin. On the 2nd of February 1901, the funeral procession made its slow, solemn journey from Osborne to Windsor. The day was cold but clear, the air filled with the low hum of thousands of mourners lining the streets. Soldiers in red and blue uniforms marched in precision. The muffled drums echoed through the crisp winter air. The coffin, draped in white satin and the royal standard, was drawn on a gun carriage, followed by King Edward VII, the new monarch, walking in silent dignity. Behind him came Kaiser Wilhelm, his expression sombre beneath his helmet, and princes from nearly every throne in Europe. From every balcony and street corner, people watched in silence, men removing their hats, women clasping handkerchiefs to their faces. The procession moved slowly through the snow-dusted countryside, past bare trees and quiet villages, until it reached Windsor Castle. There, in Street George's Chapel, the coffin was borne to the altar amid the swelling strains of Handel's Dead March. When the service ended, the casket was carried through the frosty air to the royal mausoleum at Frogmore, where Albert had lain since 1861. As the heavy doors closed behind her, the long vigil of the widow of Windsor came to an end. After 40 years of mourning, she was reunited at last with the husband she had never ceased to love. The inscription carved above their resting place read simply, "Victoria and Albert, together again." Across the empire, a great silence followed. The Victorian Age, an age of empire, invention, and faith, had drawn to its close. The world stood at the threshold of a new century, uncertain and unsteady, its certainties fading with the Queen who had given it its name. Yet her legacy endured, in the institutions she had stabilized, in the moral code she had inspired, and in the quiet strength she had embodied. The Queen is dead, long live the King. The morning after Queen Victoria's death broke cold and grey over London. The city lay hushed, as if the fog itself mourned. Shopkeepers pulled down their shutters, church bells tolled one after another, their slow notes rippling across the Thames. Newspapers, still damp with ink, carried the same stark headline in bold black type, "Her Majesty Queen Victoria is dead." Beneath those words, a silence settled not just upon Britain, but upon the entire empire. For nearly 64 years, her presence had been the steady pulse of the world's greatest power. In every corner of the globe, her name was known, spoken in reverence, sometimes in rebellion, but always with gravity. The news spread outward from Osborne like a ripple in still water. In India, colonial officials read the announcement aloud to crowds who stood in solemn curiosity. In Canada, church bells echoed through frozen streets. In Australia, where it was summer, flags were lowered under the blazing sun. On ships crossing distant oceans, sailors gathered for prayers on deck. Across 5 continents, at the same hour, men and women paused in their labours to honour the woman whose life had defined their century. In London, the Houses of Parliament went into mourning. Black draperies were hung over the entrances, and the Speaker's voice trembled as he addressed the Assembly. A great light has gone out. Crowds stood outside Buckingham Palace, silent except for the occasional sob. Old men removed their hats and crossed themselves. Women wept openly. It was as though a mother had died. Yet, amid the sorrow, life moved inexorably forward. The same telegraphs that carried news of her death now flashed the declaration of succession. At Osborne, even before her body had cooled, the formal words were spoken, "The Queen is dead. Long live the King." The continuity of monarchy, the principle she had embodied so perfectly, passed in that instant to her eldest son, Albert Edward, now Edward VII. The new king knelt beside his mother's bed, his tears still fresh. "God, help me to do my duty as she did hers," he whispered. For all their quarrels and distance, in that moment he felt the full weight of her legacy descend upon his shoulders. She had ruled longer than any monarch before her, through 7 decades of upheaval. How could anyone follow such a reign? Victoria's death was not merely the passing of a sovereign, it was the ending of an epoch. To her contemporaries, she had come to personify the very idea of order, moral, social, and divine. Her death felt like the closing of a great book, the final line of a century that had believed in progress, faith, and duty. The new century, with its machines, its cities, and its restless energies, suddenly seemed uncertain without her. At Osborne, preparations for her funeral continued according to the instructions she had left behind, an exacting list written years earlier in her own hand. She had ordered that she be buried not in black but in white, for death is not the end, but the beginning of reunion. She wished her coffin to be lined with white satin, her body dressed in her wedding veil, and her face left uncovered. Around her were placed the tokens of her life. Albert's dressing gown folded neatly at her side, a lock of her mother's hair, a photograph of her Highland servant, John Brown, hidden discreetly beneath her pillow, and a small Bible she had carried since girlhood. The days that followed were filled with ritual and remembrance. Artists and photographers came to capture her final likeness. Her face, even in death, bore the serenity of sleep, her lips faintly curved as though she dreamed. Courtiers who had served her for decades stood in the corridors of Osborne, weeping silently. Ministers arrived to pay their respects. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury knelt beside her coffin and whispered, "Your Majesty's reign has been the glory of England." Outside, the world prepared for mourning on a scale never seen before. The black-draped shop-fronts of London stretched for miles. Mourning stationery sold out within hours. Every newspaper, every church, every household seemed to share in the same vast grief. Even the stock markets paused. Even the factories fell still. The empire itself seemed to draw a single, shuddering breath. Yet, in the midst of this public mourning, the machinery of transition began. Edward VII, now 59, ascended the throne at last, after a lifetime of waiting. He had been the perpetual heir, the man in waiting, overshadowed by the memory of his father and the authority of his mother. Now, with a mixture of sadness and relief, he began to take up the reins of government. His first act as king was to honour his mother's wish that her funeral be not a dirge, but a procession of peace. "No gloom, no black horses," she had written. "Let there be white, and let music speak of faith." The funeral cortege would pass from Osborne to Portsmouth, then by royal yacht to London, and finally to Windsor, where she would be laid beside Albert at Frogmore. The entire route was to be lined with soldiers of the Empire, each regiment representing the nations she had ruled. The day of departure arrived on the 1st of February 1901. The morning dawned still and bright, the air cold and clear. Her coffin, draped in white satin and the royal standard, was borne from Osborne House by sailors of the Royal Navy. The music of a military band drifted across the grounds Handel's Dead March from Saul, slow and solemn. As the procession moved toward the shore, the waves of the Solent lapped quietly against the pier. The coffin was placed aboard the royal yacht Alberta, followed by the new king, the Kaiser of Germany, and a retinue of princes and officers. As the ship set out toward the mainland, guns thundered from every fort along the coast. The sound rolled through the mist like distant thunder. Crowds lined the harbours, watching the white-draped coffin pass slowly out to sea. Women knelt, men bowed their heads. The Empire's heart beat in unison for that one final voyage. When the yacht reached Portsmouth, the coffin was transferred to a special train bound for London. At every station along the route, people waited in silence, villagers, miners, factory workers, standing bareheaded as the royal train passed. Many wept openly, some knelt by the tracks. It was as though the soul of the nation followed her through the countryside she had loved so well. In London, the scene was overwhelming. The procession from Victoria Station to Paddington stretched for miles. Soldiers from across the empire stood in perfect ranks. Highland regiments in tartan, Indian cavalry in turbans and sashes, Canadians in scarlet coats, Australians in khaki. Their bayonets caught the winter light as the coffin passed. Behind it walked Edward VII, dignified and solemn, his head bowed. Beside him, the German Kaiser, his face pale and grim. Behind them came kings, princes, dukes, and dignitaries from every corner of Europe. Never before and never again would so many crowned heads walk in one procession. The city was silent, except for the measured tread of soldiers and the slow rhythm of drums. Even the horses' hooves seemed muffled. Black draperies hung from every balcony, and in the windows of countless homes, candles burned in quiet tribute. When the train reached Windsor, the cortege continued through the castle gates, up the long walk, lined with thousands of soldiers, and into St. George's Chapel. Inside, under the vaulted ceiling that had witnessed the coronations of her ancestors, the final service began. The coffin was set before the altar, its white satin gleaming under candlelight. The choir sang softly, "Lead, kindly light," amid the encircling gloom. At the end of the service, her body was borne from the chapel through the cold dusk to the royal mausoleum at Frogmore. There, before the bronze doors, Edward VII paused, his tears visible as he whispered, "Good night, dear Mamma." The coffin was lowered beside Albert's, the marble lids sealed together for eternity. The inscription carved into the tombstone would later read, "Here lies Victoria. By the grace of God, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, Empress of India, who reigned 63 years and 7 months, beloved of her people, honoured of God, together again with her beloved husband, Albert the Good." As the doors closed, the last page of the Victorian Age turned. That night, across the empire, candles were lit in homes and churches. In London, Big Ben tolled midnight through the fog. In Calcutta, crowds gathered by the river to hear prayers for the Kaisar-i-Hind. In Melbourne, in Cape Town, in Montreal, people stood in silence, facing the portrait of the Queen who had ruled over them all. Her reign had outlasted revolutions, famine, and war. Her image had bridged oceans. Now, her passing joined the living and the dead in one vast communion of memory. In the days that followed, a strange quiet settled over Britain. The air felt different, as if the great heart of the century had stopped beating and the new one had not yet begun. People spoke softly, their words wrapped in reverence. For many, the grief felt personal. "I was born in her reign," one woman said, "and I cannot imagine the world without her." The empire, too, seemed to sense that something irretrievable had ended. The age of invention and optimism, the confidence in progress and destiny, had lost its queen. A new century, restless and uncertain, now stretched ahead, one that would soon bring war, disillusionment, and the collapse of the world she had built. But for the moment, all that lay hidden. For the moment, her people still believed in her legacy, that duty, love, and faith could hold the world together. Edward VII would go on to reign for only 9 years. He brought with him the gaiety and modernity of a new age, the Edwardian era, brief and bright like a dawn before storm. But he ruled in the shadow of his mother's legend. She was more than a queen, he told an aide. She was the spirit of her people. And so the world moved on. The trains resumed their timetables, the factories reopened, and the newspapers turned from mourning to headlines of politics and progress. But the memory of the old queen lingered in the collective soul of her people. Her name, Victoria, became a synonym for endurance, dignity, and the moral heart of a vanished age. In the centuries that followed, her image would remain fixed in time, the stern yet kindly face beneath the widow's veil, the sovereign whose shadow stretched across the earth. Statues rose in her honour in every dominion and city. In London's Victoria Memorial, she sits enthroned in marble, gazing eternally toward the Mall, serene and unyielding. Around her, angels of truth, charity, and justice lift their wings, a monument not only to her life, but to the faith she inspired. The bells that tolled for her that January night have long fallen silent, yet the echo of their sound endures in history. For when Queen Victoria died, it was not merely a crown that passed, it was an era, a vision, and a world. The age that bore her name would never come again, the legacy of Victoria. In the quiet years that followed her passing, the empire learned what it meant to live without Queen Victoria. Her death had not simply left a void in the monarchy, it had created a silence in the collective consciousness of a people who had never known another sovereign. The Victorian Age had been more than a period. It had been a moral code, a rhythm of life, a mirror of faith and duty reflected in her image. When the bells stopped tolling and the black draperies came down, Britain awoke to a new century that no longer carried her hand upon its shoulder. Yet even in her absence, her influence lingered like a voice beneath the noise of modernity. Her name remained etched upon the face of the world, on cities, rivers, and schools, upon statues and public squares, in the hearts of millions who had never met her but had lived beneath her shadow. The empire that stretched from the red plains of Africa to the snows of Canada still bore her imprint in law, custom, and conscience. And though her body rested beside Albert's in the quiet tomb at Frogmore, her spirit continued to animate the age that bore her name. The reign of Edward VII began almost immediately to reshape Britain's mood. Where Victoria's court had been austere and moral, Edward's was cosmopolitan and exuberant. The new king loved travel, fashion, and society. He embodied a different kind of royalty, outward, worldly, and modern. The Edwardian era sparkled with a brightness that seemed to contrast the heavy velvet drapes of his mother's time. Women's dresses lightened, music halls flourished. Motor cars and electric lights transformed cities into realms of speed and spectacle. Yet beneath this gaiety lay an unspoken reverence for the woman who had come before. In his first address to Parliament, Edward invoked his mother's memory with solemnity. Her life, he said, was an example of devotion to duty, of faith in Providence, and of love for her people. It shall be my constant endeavour to walk in her path. The applause that followed was not for him but for the departed Queen, whose ghost seemed still to preside over the chamber. Even as Britain rushed into a new century, it did so with her image hovering above it, an invisible moral guardian whose authority was beyond question. Monuments to Victoria began to rise almost immediately after her death. The most magnificent of these, the Victoria Memorial outside Buckingham Palace, took 10 years to complete. Designed by Sir Thomas Brock and unveiled in 1911, it portrayed her seated in marble majesty, gazing eternally toward the Mall. Around her clustered allegorical figures of truth, justice, and charity virtues she had come to symbolize. Beneath her feet, bronze angels lifted their wings toward the sky. The base of the monument bore a single inscription, Victoria Regina Imperatrix. When the memorial was unveiled, King George V, her grandson, stood before it in silence. Around him, thousands gathered, their faces lit by sunlight glinting on marble. Bands played solemn hymns, and the crowd bowed their heads as the Union Jack unfurled above the statue. For that moment, it was as if time had folded back, and the empire stood again at her feet. Her legacy was not confined to stone. It lived in institutions she had strengthened, in the stability of the constitutional monarchy, in the permanence of parliamentary democracy, and in the moral imagination of her people. Before Victoria, the British crown had teetered on the brink of irrelevance. The scandals of her uncles, George IV's extravagance, William IV's volatility, had tarnished the monarchy's reputation. When she ascended the throne, it was fragile, uncertain, and distrusted. Through her discipline, she had remade it into the cornerstone of the nation's identity. The idea that monarchy could exist not as domination but as moral stewardship was her greatest innovation. She had turned royal life into a model of domestic virtue, transforming the crown into a symbol of family, faith, and duty. Even those who sought to reform the state could not help but respect her sincerity. She had been a queen who prayed, a widow who mourned, a mother who worked. Her humanity had restored majesty to the throne without demanding fear or awe. This transformation shaped not only Britain but every dominion under her rule. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, her image represented stability and belonging. In India, she was revered as a distant but benevolent mother. Statues of her rose in Calcutta, Delhi, Melbourne, and Cape Town. In many places, the local people had never seen her face except in portraits, yet they spoke her name with respect. Her reign, for all its imperial contradictions, had given the empire a sense of moral unity it had never before known. But history would come to judge her empire differently. In the decades after her death, the great edifice of British power began to crack. The Boer War had already exposed the brutality of imperial conquest. Revolts in India and Ireland soon followed. By the mid-20th century, the empire she had helped build was unraveling. To some, her name came to symbolize not moral grandeur but imperial arrogance. Yet even her critics acknowledged the sincerity of her faith in duty. She had not sought empire for glory or greed, but because she believed, however misguidedly, that Britain carried a moral obligation to uplift the world. Her personal legacy within the royal family was equally complex. She had been, in every sense, a matriarch of Europe. Her children and grandchildren sat upon the thrones of Germany, Russia, Spain, Norway, and Greece. The intermarriage of her descendants had been intended to preserve peace through family ties. "When one is kin with all," she had once said, "war must surely be impossible," but history proved otherwise. Only 13 years after her death, Europe descended into the Great War, a conflict that pitted her grandchildren against one another. King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, three rulers who had once played together as children in her drawing rooms, now led their nations into battle. It was as though the family she had so carefully woven into the tapestry of Europe had torn itself apart. Soldiers on both sides carried photographs of their sovereigns into the trenches, never realizing that their enemies were cousins by blood.